He kissed her in front of 40 million people. Not a cheek kiss, not a polite, obligatory brush of lips that powerful men give their assistants at charity events. Adrian Blackwood, the man whose name made federal prosecutors sweat through their suits, the man who controlled every shipping port from Boston to Baltimore, grabbed Sabrina Cole by the jaw with one hand, tipped her face up like she was something he owned, and kissed her on the mouth. On stage, under a chandelier that cost more than most Americans made in a decade. While cameras flashed and celebrities clapped and the host laughed nervously into his microphone, 40 million people saw it. Only one understood what it meant. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you trusted with everything, your name, your future, your body, hit that like button right now. Subscribe and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Because what Evelyn Blackwood did next didn't make headlines. It didn't trend online. But it was the most devastating thing one woman has ever done to the most powerful criminal organization on the East Coast. And she did it without raising her voice once. This is part 1. The gala was called A Night for New Horizons. Corporate sponsorships, a string quartet, $600 dinner plates, and enough old money in one ballroom to fund a small nation's infrastructure budget. The Blackwood Foundation had hosted it for 11 consecutive years. Evelyn had organized the first 9 herself, the seating charts, the floral arrangements, the donor acknowledgement letters typed in her careful handwriting before she'd hired staff to do it. This year she hadn't attended. Her obstetrician had recommended she rest. 11 weeks was early enough that most people didn't show, but Evelyn had been exhausted in a way that went past physical. A bone-deep weariness that started somewhere behind her sternum and radiated outward. She'd told Adrian she would watch the live stream from home. He'd kissed her forehead at the door, adjusted his cufflinks, and told her he'd be back before midnight. She was sitting on the couch in their penthouse with a mug of ginger tea going cold on the cushion beside her when the kiss happened. The television was background noise. She'd muted the speeches 20 minutes in and was reading through Foundation quarterly reports when the audio cut back in. Some instinct, some shift in the crowd noise that her body registered before her brain did. And she looked up. She saw Adrian's hand first. The way it moved to Sabrina's face was practiced, familiar. That was the word that hit her before anything else, before the shock or the humiliation or the arithmetic of betrayal. Familiar. The way you touch someone you'd touched 100 times before. The way you move towards someone whose face you'd already memorized. Evelyn set down her papers. She watched the kiss last 6 seconds. She counted, not because she was calculating anything yet, just because her mind had gone somewhere quiet and precise, the way it always did when things got very bad. 6 seconds on national television. The crowd noise swelled. Someone near a microphone whooped. The host said something Evelyn didn't process. She picked up her mug of ginger tea. She drank what was left of it, cold, without tasting it. Then she put the mug down on the coffee table, stood up slowly the way her body required these days, and walked into the bedroom. She did not cry. She would think about that later, why she hadn't cried. She'd expected herself to. She'd always been someone who cried at things, sad films, certain pieces of music. The week after her father died, she'd cried in the cereal aisle of a grocery store because he used to eat the same brand. She was not a person who'd trained herself out of feeling things. But standing in the bedroom of the apartment she'd shared with Adrian Blackwood for 6 years, watching the city lights through the floor-to-ceiling windows, she found that what moved through her wasn't grief. It was clarity. Everything she'd half known and pushed aside and rationalized and refused to look at directly for, she didn't know how long, 8 months, maybe more, suddenly arranged itself into a shape she could see clearly. Late nights with explanations that were just slightly too detailed. A change in how he touched her, the way he'd started putting his phone face down. None of it had been enough on its own. Together, organized by that 6-second image she'd just watched on a 60-inch screen, it was a complete picture. She went to the window and looked at the city for a long time. Then she went to the vault. Her father had built it into the penthouse when he'd purchased the property in 1987. Elias Harrington had been a careful man, a financier who'd survived 2 market crashes and 1 very unpleasant congressional inquiry by keeping his most important documents in his personal possession. He'd taught Evelyn how to use the combination when she was 17. When she'd married Adrian and they'd moved into the penthouse together, Evelyn had thought about telling him the combination. She'd never gotten around to it. She was grateful for that now. Inside the vault were originals, her father's investment ledgers, her personal trust documents, the Harrington family's legal instruments that predated her marriage by decades, certificates, correspondence, the architectural details of financial structures. Elias had spent 30 years building, structures that Evelyn had quietly adapted and extended after his death, that now underpinned a substantial portion of what Adrian publicly called the Blackwood Foundation's legitimate investment portfolio. Adrian had always understood, in a general way, that Evelyn's inherited wealth was significant. He'd never fully understood the mechanics. He was brilliant at what he did: the management of men, the architecture of fear, the delicate geopolitics of organized crime. But financial structures bored him. He'd always left that to Evelyn. She'd managed it quietly, without complaint, without taking credit, because that was the kind of marriage she'd believed she was in. She stood in the vault for a long time. She wasn't removing anything yet. She was just looking, cataloging. Her mind moving through the inventory the way it moved through everything, methodically, without hurry, without wasted motion. She was thinking about what belonged to her and what had always belonged to her, and what she had mistakenly allowed to become entangled with someone else's name. She closed the vault at 2:17 in the morning. She went to bed. She slept. Adrian came home at 4:43. She heard the elevator, heard him moving through the apartment, heard him stop outside the bedroom door. She lay still with her eyes open, listening to the pause, the calculation happening on the other side of the door, whether she was awake, what she'd seen, what condition he might find her in. He opened the door quietly. She said, "I watched the live stream." The silence that followed had a texture to it. She could hear him breathing. "Evelyn, you don't need to come up with anything tonight," she said. "I'm not going to yell at you. I'm too tired and I have a doctor's appointment at 9. We can talk tomorrow." Another pause. "Are you okay?" She thought about what an odd question that was. She thought about answering it honestly. "I'm going to sleep," she said instead. "Close the door." He did. She lay in the dark and listened to him move to the guest room and wondered, with a detached kind of curiosity, how long he'd been doing this. Not emotionally. She'd already processed the emotional dimension in the 40 minutes she'd spent at the window. Logistically. She was wondering about the timeline, when it had started, what she'd been doing during specific moments that now needed to be recontextualized. She fell asleep calculating. The conversation happened the next morning at the kitchen table. Adrian was already up when she came out, which was unusual. He'd made coffee, real coffee, not the pod machine, the French press she'd given up in her first trimester because the smell had started making her sick. He'd forgotten about that. He was sitting at the table looking like a man who'd rehearsed something and was no longer sure his script was adequate. Evelyn poured herself a glass of water and sat down across from him. He looked terrible. That registered somewhere. The dark circles, the set of his jaw, the way he was holding himself like he was braced for impact. Adrian Blackwood was not a man who looked terrible often. She'd seen him walk into rooms where people were actively afraid of him and look completely at ease. Whatever he'd spent the night doing, it had cost him. Good, she thought, and was briefly surprised at herself for thinking it. The kiss, he started, was not a kiss between colleagues, she said. We can skip that part. His jaw tightened. It's complicated. It always is. He looked at the table. He had good hands. She'd always noticed that, the way they moved when he was thinking, a restless, precise energy. Right now they were wrapped around his coffee mug and completely still. I didn't plan for it to happen publicly. You didn't plan for me to see it. That's not... He stopped, started again. No, that's fair. She waited. It's been... He exhaled, ran a hand across his face. It's been about a year. A year. She'd suspected 8 months. She did the arithmetic quickly, where she'd been a year ago, what she'd been doing, what she remembered of their marriage at that point, their anniversary trip to Tuscany, the dinner she'd cooked for his birthday, the night she'd told him about the pregnancy and he'd held her face in both hands and looked at her like she was something extraordinary. A year. I'm going to need you to leave the penthouse for a few days, she said. He looked up. Evelyn, I'm not asking you to leave permanently. I'm asking you to give me space to think without you in the apartment. You can stay at the Midtown property. She kept her voice level. She was aware of something happening beneath the levelness, a pressure building, something that would eventually need somewhere to go, but not here. Not yet. Not in front of him. I'll have Thomas contact your assistant about logistics. I don't want Adrian. She said it quietly, just his name. But something in the way she said it stopped him. He looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since he'd sat down, and she watched something cross his face that she couldn't fully read. Shock, maybe, or the beginning of understanding. I'm asking you nicely. Please leave. He left that afternoon. She called her attorney, Martin Reeves, before Adrian's car had cleared the parking garage. Martin had been her father's attorney first. He'd drafted the original Harrington Trust documents in 1994 and had quietly updated them 3 times since Elias's death. He was 71 years old, retired from his firm, but still handling the Harrington family's affairs personally, and when Evelyn called him on a Sunday afternoon and said she needed to meet the following morning, he said, "I'll be there at 8. She spent Sunday evening going through financial documents, not the Blackwood Foundation records. Those were complex and intertwined in ways that would take time to properly understand. Her personal records, the Harrington trusts, the investment accounts in her name, the property holdings that traced back to her father. She had a yellow legal pad and she made notes in her careful, precise handwriting. And by 10 o'clock, she had a clear picture of what was hers and what had become entangled and what the entanglement would cost to undo. The picture was better than she'd feared. Her father's structures had been designed to survive exactly this kind of thing. Not divorce specifically, but the general category of one party attempting to lay claim to what had always belonged to the Harrington family. Elias had not been a sentimental man, but he'd loved his daughter with a ferocity that expressed itself in paperwork. Every major Harrington asset was in trust. Every trust had been carefully documented to predate the marriage. She went to bed at 11 and slept 9 hours. The meeting with Martin lasted 4 hours. He sat across from her in the penthouse library, his reading glasses on the end of his nose, going through documents she'd organized into labeled folders. And at the end of it, he looked at her over his glasses and said, "You've already done most of the work." "I've been thinking about this structure for a while," she said. He watched her for a moment. "How long?" She thought about it honestly. "I think I've been filing things carefully for about 18 months. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, something more like professional admiration. "Your father would have approved of that." "My father would have told me I waited too long." Martin made a sound that might have been agreement. "What's your timeline?" "I want to begin immediately, but I want it done correctly. I'm not trying to destroy anything. I'm trying to protect what's mine." "That's a distinction the courts appreciate." He tapped the stack of documents. "Realistically, the trust transfers can be completed within 2 weeks. The foundation positions are more complicated. You'll need to formally resign from the boards, give proper notice." "I understand." "The name change is administrative. Your professional name is legally already Harrington. You never changed it on your licenses. It's more about public designation." "I want it consistent everywhere," she said. "Every document, every public record, every professional context." Martin looked at her for a long moment. "Evelyn," he said, and his voice had shifted into something gentler. "Is there anything you want to tell me about how you're doing?" She thought about the question seriously before answering. "I'm 11 weeks pregnant," she said. "I'm exhausted all the time and I can't drink coffee. I've just discovered my husband has been having an affair for approximately a year, and that 40 million people watched him prove it on television. And I feel—" She paused, looked for the honest word. "Purposeful, that's the word. I feel very purposeful right now." Martin removed his reading glasses. "That concerns me a little." "It shouldn't," she said. "It's what I'm like when things are very clear." He nodded slowly. Then he put his glasses back on and reached for his pen. "Let's get started." The first call came from Adrian's captain, a man named Victor Rains, 3 days after Adrian moved to the Midtown property. Victor Rains had been with the Blackwood organization for 22 years. He was 63, built like a retired linebacker, and possessed of a political intelligence that had kept him alive through 3 changes in Blackwood leadership. He called Evelyn's personal cell phone on a Tuesday afternoon, which was unusual enough that she answered instead of sending it to voicemail. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said. "Evelyn," she corrected, as she'd been correcting everyone for 3 days. A brief pause. "Evelyn, I'm calling because there are people in the organization who are concerned about the situation." "Which situation?" Another pause. Longer. She could hear him deciding how much to say. The public nature of what happened, the implications. Some of the captains are worried about stability. I'm not in the organization, Victor. I never was. Whatever concerns the captains have about stability, they should bring them to Adrian. Some of them feel that... He stopped. This is delicate. Everything's delicate lately. Say what you called to say. He exhaled. Some of them knew about the situation with his assistant. They knew before the gala. They chose not to tell you because they believed it was a private matter that would resolve itself. Evelyn sat very still. They thought, Victor continued, his voice carefully neutral, that involving you would cause more disruption than the thing itself. She processed that, let it sit, turned it over. They thought I was decorative, she said. Silence. They looked at me, she said, and they decided I was the kind of woman who needed to be protected from reality because I wouldn't be able to handle it, and that keeping me comfortable was more important than telling me the truth. That was a mistake, Victor said. I want you to know I argued against it. Were you overruled? Yes. By how many? He hesitated. Most of them. She stood up from where she'd been sitting at the library desk and walked to the window. The city moved below her. Traffic, pedestrians, the ordinary relentless motion of 10 million people who had no idea this conversation was happening. Victor, she said. Yes. I want you to understand something. I'm not angry at you for calling me. I appreciate the information, but I need you to hear what I'm about to say and make sure the people who need to hear it understand it clearly. I'm listening. I am not decorative. I am not a wife who needs to be managed. Everything I have done for this organization, every legitimate structure, every foundation, every financial instrument that made the Blackwood name respectable in this city, I built that. My father taught me how, and I built it, and what's mine is mine, and I am currently in the process of taking it back. She paused. Does that communicate clearly? The silence on his end was different now. Yes, he said finally, very clearly. Good. She turned away from the window. Thank you for calling, Victor. She hung up and stood in the middle of the library for a moment, the phone in her hand, and noticed that her hands were shaking slightly. Not from fear, from the effort of staying that controlled. Her body knew the difference even when her voice didn't show it. She pressed her palm flat against the nearest bookshelf and breathed. 11 weeks. She had a child to protect. She had a fortune to recover. She had a marriage to dissolve cleanly and a life to rebuild from materials that had always been hers. She also had a growing suspicion, turning over slowly in the back of her mind like a stone she hadn't looked under yet, that the affair she'd spent a week processing was not the full story. Someone had called the gala's media coordinator. The live stream had been routed to an additional 12 platforms in the hour before Adrian's appearance on stage. She'd found that in the event documentation, buried in a footnote, because Evelyn Harrington had never in her life read any document without reading the footnotes. The kiss had been witnessed by far more people than a routine charity gala warranted. Someone had wanted maximum visibility. She went back to her desk and opened her laptop. She needed to understand who had wanted 40 million people watching Adrian Blackwood at exactly that moment. She needed to understand what exactly had been on display. Evelyn found the routing logs at 11:40 on a Wednesday night. She'd been working backward through the gala's production documentation for 4 days. Not continuously, because her body wouldn't allow continuous anything anymore, but in 2-hour stretches broken up by sleep and food and the mandatory rest her obstetrician had prescribed with the kind of firm cheerfulness that brooked no argument. She'd printed everything, organized it into a binder with color-coded tabs, and worked through it the way her father had taught her to work through any financial document, start at the footnotes and read toward the headline. The routing logs were in an appendix to the event's broadcast agreement, a standard document, the kind of thing that got signed and filed and never looked at again. Evelyn had read it 3 times. The live stream had been extended to additional platforms at 11:52 p.m., 4 days before the gala. Not the night of. 4 days before. Someone had contacted 12 separate streaming services and arranged for the feed to be picked up simultaneously, nearly tripling the broadcast's projected viewership. The authorization had come from a production coordinator named Daniel Fitch, whom Evelyn had never heard of, operating under a company called Meridian Event Services. which had no web presence she could locate, and a business registration address that turned out to be a UPS store in White Plains. She stared at that last detail for a long time. Then she picked up her phone and called Martin Reeves. It was almost midnight. He answered on the third ring, which told her he'd been expecting her to call at unreasonable hours eventually, and had stopped being surprised by it. "What did you find?" he said, instead of hello. She told him. The silence on his end was thoughtful rather than shocked. Martin Reeves had spent 40 years as an attorney for people who operated in complicated legal and financial landscapes. Very little shocked him. "You're thinking this wasn't accidental," he said. "I'm thinking a 3 times multiplied viewership doesn't happen because someone forgot to limit the distribution," she said. "Someone paid for that coverage, and they did it 4 days in advance, which means they knew what was going to happen on stage." "Adrian? Adrian doesn't think that way. He's—" She paused, chose the word carefully. "He's reactive. He manages situations. He doesn't stage them." "Then who?" "That's what I need to find out." She looked at the binder open on the desk in front of her. "I need someone who does investigations. Not law enforcement. Private." "I know people," Martin said. "I'll make calls in the morning." "Thank you." "Evelyn." His voice had shifted again into that careful, measured register she'd come to recognize as his version of concern. If someone staged this, if someone engineered that public moment deliberately, the implications go well past the affair. "I know. Whatever they were trying to accomplish, I know, Martin." She closed the binder. "That's why I'm calling you at midnight." She heard him exhale slowly. "Get some sleep. I'll have a name for you by 9. She tried to sleep. She managed about 5 hours, broken and thin, the kind of sleep that leaves you more aware of having been unconscious than actually rested. She lay in the dark and thought about the word engineered. Thought about what it would mean if the public humiliation she'd spent a week processing as a personal catastrophe was, in fact, someone else's instrument. Thought about who benefited from Adrian Blackwood looking like a faithless fool on national television. That list, she suspected, was not short. Adrian called at 8:15 the next morning. She let it ring twice before answering. Not as a power move. She wasn't interested in power moves. They were exhausting and juvenile. But because she was pouring water for her morning tea and didn't want to spill it. "I'm here," she said. "I want to come home." His voice was flat and stripped of its usual authority. He sounded like a man who hadn't been sleeping well either, which she noted without satisfaction. "That's not something I can agree to right now." "Evelyn, I'm not punishing you, Adrian." She sat down at the kitchen table. "I need space to think clearly, and I can't do that with you in the apartment. That's a practical statement, not an emotional one." "You've been moving money." She set her mug down. "How do you know that?" "Because I have people who track financial movements connected to the organization." "Nothing I've moved is connected to the organization. Everything I've moved is mine. It was always mine. You know that." She kept her voice steady. "If you're surveilling my personal accounts, Adrian, that's a conversation you need to have with your attorney." "I'm not—" He stopped. "I'm not surveilling you. One of the bank flags came up in a routine review. I wasn't looking for it." "But you found it." "Yes." She picked up her mug again. "Then you should understand what's happening. I'm protecting assets that belong to me and to our child. You don't have a legal claim on them. You never did. I would encourage you to confirm that with your own attorney before this becomes adversarial." The pause that followed was long enough that she wondered if the call had dropped. Then he said, "Are we getting divorced?" She'd expected the question. She'd thought about how to answer it honestly without being cruel and without making promises she didn't know she could keep. "I'm not making permanent decisions at 11 weeks pregnant in the middle of a crisis," she said. "What I'm doing is making sure that whatever happens, our child's financial future is protected and my autonomy is intact. Those are the only decisions I'm capable of making clearly right now." "That sounds like yes." "It sounds like I don't know yet." She stood up, moved to the window. Outside, the morning was gray and specific, the kind of November light that made everything look like it was being photographed for evidence. "Adrian, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly." "Okay." "Did you arrange for additional broadcast coverage at the gala? Did you or anyone on your staff contact outside streaming services to expand the feed?" Silence. Different this time. Not the silence of calculation, but of genuine confusion. "What?" The live stream was extended to 12 additional platforms 4 days before the event. The authorization came from a company I can't verify. I need to know if that came from your side. I don't... She heard him moving, heard a door open and close. No, I had nothing to do with the broadcast arrangements. Sabrina handled event logistics. Sabrina, of course. Did Sabrina have authorization to make broadcast decisions independently? She had broad discretion on event logistics. Yes, she had that authority. His voice had changed. The flatness was still there, but something had sharpened underneath it. She recognized that sharpening. It was the way he sounded when something was clicking into place in his mind. Why would she expand the broadcast? I don't know yet, Evelyn said, but I think that's the question you should be spending your morning on. She hung up before he could respond. The investigator Martin sent her was named Clara Pham. She was 54, former FBI Financial Crimes Unit, now running a boutique private investigation firm that specialized in what she called complex network mapping. She arrived at the penthouse at 2 p.m. with a leather satchel, flat shoes, and the kind of stillness that suggested she'd spent a long time in rooms where the wrong movement could end badly. Evelyn liked her immediately. They sat in the library and Evelyn laid out what she had: the routing logs, the Meridian Event Services registration, Daniel Fitch's name, the timeline of the affair versus the timeline of the public exposure, and Clara listened without taking notes for the first 20 minutes. Just listened. Then she asked 6 questions, all of them specific, all of them aimed at details Evelyn hadn't thought to emphasize. The broadcast expansion was authorized 4 days before, Clara said. The affair had been ongoing for approximately a year. Why did the exposure happen at this gala and not earlier? I don't know. What was different about this event compared to prior ones, Evelyn thought. The foundation announced a major investment transition this year. Adrian was going to announce new legitimate partnerships, real estate development, 2 manufacturing acquisitions. It was being framed as a shift toward expanded public presence. Clara was quiet for a moment. So the organization was more visible than usual, more stakeholders paying attention, more scrutiny. Yes. And the public scandal happened at exactly the moment when visibility was at its highest and a leadership disruption would be maximally damaging. Evelyn looked at her. Yes. Clara made a small sound, not quite approval, not quite alarm. Mrs. Blackwood. Evelyn. Evelyn, have you considered that the affair may have been an instrument rather than an event? What do you mean? I mean that someone may have encouraged, facilitated, or engineered the affair itself, not just its public exposure, specifically to create a vulnerability in the Blackwood organization's leadership at a moment of maximum consequence. The room was quiet. Outside, the city made its relentless noise, sirens, traffic, a helicopter, somewhere. Evelyn sat with what Clara had just said and turned it over and looked at it from multiple angles the way she looked at everything. You're describing a conspiracy, she said. I'm describing a possibility that the evidence you've given me is consistent with, Clara said. I'm not concluding anything, but the architecture of what you're showing me, the timeline, the staged public moment, the unverifiable company, this isn't the fingerprint of a personal decision. This is the fingerprint of a plan. Evelyn stood up. She walked to the window. She kept ending up at windows, she'd noticed, as if altitude helped her think, and looked at the city and breathed. Someone used Sabrina, she said. Possibly. Someone recruited her, put her in position, let it run for a year, and then triggered the exposure at exactly the right moment. That's one interpretation of what you've shown me. Who benefits from Adrian being publicly humiliated and politically weakened at the exact moment the organization is expanding its legitimate profile? Clara said nothing. She was letting Evelyn work it out. Someone who wants his position, Evelyn said. Someone inside. Someone who's been watching the timing and waiting for the right moment to make the instability look self-inflicted. That would be consistent, Clara said carefully. Evelyn turned from the window. Find Daniel Fitch. Find Meridian Event Services. Find the money trail from whoever authorized that broadcast expansion and trace it back to its origin. She paused. Whatever it costs. Understood. Clara picked up her satchel. This will take some time. I have time, Evelyn said. I'm not going anywhere. Adrian confronted Sabrina on a Thursday. He didn't tell Evelyn about it until afterward, which was how she found out things were moving faster than she'd anticipated. Victor Rains called her again, not on the weekend this time, but at 6 p.m. on a Thursday, and his voice had a texture she hadn't heard before. Tight. Careful in a way that suggested he was choosing every word while also aware that there might not be time for careful. He brought her to the Midtown property, Victor said. He questioned her for about 2 hours. And? A pause that felt like a man pressing his back against a door. She told him things. Evelyn sat down slowly. What things? She told him she'd been placed, that someone, she named a name, had approached her before she ever applied for the assistant position, that her recruitment was deliberate and the relationship was directed. The word directed landed in Evelyn's chest like something physical. She named someone, Evelyn said. Yes? Who? Victor said a name she recognized, not from the organization, from family, from the peripheral, elegant, occasionally menacing geography of the Blackwood family tree. Logan Blackwood, Adrian's cousin, 41 years old, ran a mid-sized logistics company in New Jersey that everyone knew was a front and that no one discussed openly because the Blackwood family maintained its fictions with the dedication of a theater troupe. Logan, who had come to their wedding and danced with Evelyn and said charming things about her dress. Logan, who called Adrian twice a year, always on his birthday and always on New Year's, with a consistency that now struck Evelyn as less like affection than maintenance. She was quiet long enough that Victor said her name. I heard you, she said. I'm thinking. There's more. She waited. Sabrina said Logan had been building his own network for almost 2 years. Using the affair as cover, using the distraction it created inside the organization, to move people and money and resources without Adrian noticing. The public scandal wasn't just about embarrassing Adrian. It was supposed to trigger a leadership challenge, a formal council review. He wanted Adrian removed. He wanted to be positioned as the obvious replacement when Adrian fell. Victor's voice was stripped now. No politics, no careful framing, just the thing itself. He's been running his own operation in parallel for 2 years. Some of our captains were on his payroll without Adrian knowing it. Evelyn thought about the captains who'd known about the affair and said nothing. Thought about the decision to keep her uninformed, to write her off as a decorative presence who needed protecting from reality. Thought about how useful her invisibility had been, not just to Adrian, but to Logan. An invisible woman didn't ask questions. An invisible woman didn't trace broadcast authorizations to UPS stores in White Plains. How many captains? She asked. We don't know yet. Is Adrian safe? The pause before Victor answered told her everything about how seriously he was taking the question. For now. Logan hasn't made a move yet. He's waiting for the council meeting. There's a scheduled review of Blackwood leadership in about a week. He's planning to make his case formally, with enough bot support to carry it. And without a formal challenge, he can't take Adrian's position. Not without starting a war he's not ready to finish, Victor said. He needs the council. He needs it to look legitimate. Evelyn stood up. She moved through the library without particularly deciding to, just moving because staying still felt suddenly impossible. She was thinking about Clara Pham's money trail, about broadcast authorizations and shell companies, and an affair that had lasted a year as an operational instrument. About a man who had danced at her wedding and calculated the distance between that moment and this one for 22 months. Victor, she said. Does Adrian know all of this? He knows what Sabrina told him. He's trying to verify it. What's his state of mind? A long pause. He's controlled, on the outside. But I've known him for 15 years, and I can tell you that underneath the controlled part, Victor stopped. Say it. He's scared, Victor said. He's not used to being outmaneuvered. He doesn't know how to operate in a situation where the problem started before he knew there was a problem. She stopped walking. Stood in the middle of the library with her hand pressed flat against her sternum, the way she'd been doing when the pressure built too high, when the thing behind her breastbone needed something to push against. Tell him, she said slowly, that I want to speak with him, tonight, here. Victor was quiet for a moment. Are you sure? No, she said honestly. Set it up anyway. Adrian arrived at 8:30. She'd spent the intervening 2 hours eating something. She'd lost track of whether she'd eaten properly, and her body had started making its objections known in specific physical ways that she couldn't afford to ignore, and going over everything Clara had sent her so far. It wasn't complete, but it was enough. Enough to see the shape of it. Enough to understand that what she'd believed was a personal catastrophe was in fact the visible surface of something much larger and much colder. He looked worse than he had 3 days ago. That was her first thought when she opened the door. Not sympathy exactly, more like clinical observation. He was wearing a coat he hadn't bothered to take off yet, standing in her doorway, and he looked like a man who had spent the week dismantling a building with his bare hands and was only now realizing he was standing in the rubble. She stood aside and let him in. They sat in the library. She'd made tea, ginger again, the same mug, the ritual of it something her body had started to rely on. He sat across from her and looked at the tea and didn't speak, which was unusual enough that she waited him out. She worked for him for 6 months before she came to me, he said finally, before she even applied. He built a cover identity, a resume, references. He placed her, and then he waited, and he stopped, put his fist against his mouth briefly, then lowered his hand. He used me. Yes. He used... Adrian looked at the floor. Something was happening in his face that she'd very rarely seen, a kind of undisguised rawness. Not grief, not anger exactly, something more fundamental. The look of a man whose understanding of the world has just been structurally altered. He was at our house last Christmas. I know. He held our son. He caught himself. The baby. He asked about the pregnancy. He sat in my kitchen and asked about the baby, and he'd been running this for 19 months, Evelyn said, possibly longer. My investigator is tracing the money. Adrian looked up. Your investigator? I hired someone 3 days ago. She's good. Former federal. She's been tracing the broadcast authorization from the gala, and she's found connections I haven't fully verified yet, but the direction is consistent with what Sabrina told you. He stared at her. You were already investigating. I was investigating why someone wanted 40 million people watching you on that stage, she said. I didn't know who yet. Now I have a name. The look on his face shifted. Something complicated moving through it, admiration tangled up with something that might have been shame. He looked away. I owe you. Don't, she said. I didn't do it for you. I did it because someone staged a public event that affected my life, and I needed to understand why. Don't make it about us right now. His jaw tightened. He accepted that. The council meeting is in 8 days. Victor told me. Logan has bought at least 4 captains, maybe more. If he walks into that room with enough support, it becomes a formal vote on my leadership. If I lose that vote, he exhaled, the organization fractures. And when organizations like mine fracture, people die. Not metaphorically. She thought about that. Let it sit with the full weight of what it meant, not as an abstraction, but as a physical reality. People she'd met at dinners, men who'd worked for the Blackwood organization for decades, whose wives had shaken her hand, and whose children she'd asked about. The collateral reality of what happened when power structures collapsed violently. What do you need to stop it? She asked. He looked at her directly for the first time since he'd walked in. Evidence. Documented, verifiable evidence of what Logan's been doing. The bought captains, the parallel operation, the money flows. If I walk into that council room with proof, he can't run a political play. It becomes a criminal accountability hearing and the council will turn on him. And you have Sabrina's account. Verbal. She's willing to give a sworn statement, but it's one person's testimony against Logan's 2 years of careful groundwork. I need documentation. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. She thought about everything that had happened in the past 10 days. The kiss. The conversation in this room at 8 in the morning with him holding a coffee cup and looking rehearsed. A year. She thought about the vault and the legal pad and Martin Reeves sitting across from her in this same room saying you've already done most of the work. She thought about the child she was carrying. Nathan, she'd already decided, though she hadn't told anyone yet. Nathan Harrington, because the name he carried into the world was going to be hers. This child had not asked to be born into the intersection of an empire and a conspiracy and a marriage that had failed under circumstances that were simultaneously personal and calculated. He needed to be protected. That was not a complicated equation. My investigator, she said slowly, has been tracing Logan's financial movements through the broadcast authorization. If the money trail goes where I think it goes, we'll have documented connections between Logan and Meridian Event Services, between Meridian and the captains he's been paying, and between those payments and the operational structure he's been building. Adrian was very still. How close is she? Days. Maybe less. She looked at him. I'm not giving you this information because we're reconciling. I'm not giving it to you because I've decided to come back. I'm giving it to you because the person Logan is trying to destroy controls assets that belong to my child, and I will not allow my child's inheritance to be collateral damage in your cousin's power grab. He held her gaze. I understand. I want it in writing, she said. Whatever evidence we produce, whatever comes out of the council meeting, my involvement is confidential. My name doesn't appear in any Blackwood organization record. My assets are formally separated before this goes any further. Agreed. I want Martin Reeves present when we formalize that. Fine. And I want... She stopped. Something had moved in her chest. Something that wasn't strategic and wasn't legal and wasn't the cold, purposeful clarity she'd been operating from for 10 days. She pressed her hand against her sternum again. Breathed. I want you to understand that what you did, the affair, the year of it, the particular quality of its ordinariness, that's not something I can undo by helping you. You need to know that. I'm not building a path back to us. I'm protecting my son. Adrian said nothing for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was stripped of everything except the bare fact of it. I know, he said. I know that. They sat in the library in silence for a while. Outside, the city made its noise. Inside, the specific, exhausted weight of everything they'd said settled around them like sediment. Then Evelyn's phone buzzed on the desk. She reached for it, looked at the screen. It was a message from Clara Pham. 4 words and an attachment. Found him. Look at this. Evelyn opened the attachment. It was a photograph. Taken through glass, from a distance, slightly blurred at the edges the way surveillance photographs always were. 2 people at a restaurant table, heads close together, the particular posture of people who don't want to be seen having the conversation they're having. Logan Blackwood and Sabrina Cole. The timestamp in the corner of the photograph read, 14 months ago. 4 months before Sabrina had ever applied for the position of Adrian's executive assistant. 7 months before the affair, by Adrian's own account, had started. Evelyn looked at the timestamp. Then she looked at Adrian. She held the phone out to him without a word. He took it. He looked at the photograph. She watched his face as he read the timestamp, watched him do the same arithmetic she'd just done, watched the moment when the full architecture of it landed. Not just that he'd been used, not just that the affair had been engineered, but that the timeline extended back further than even Sabrina's confession had indicated. Logan had started building this before Adrian had even met Sabrina. The planning had been patient, meticulous. 2 years of positioning and waiting and maintaining the appearance of a devoted, if distant, cousin while systematically laying the groundwork to take everything. Adrian set the phone down on the desk very carefully. He stood up. He walked to the window, the same window Evelyn kept returning to, and stood there with his back to her, and she watched his shoulders and the set of his neck and the particular stillness of a man who is deciding something irreversible. I need to make a call, he said. I know. If I do what I'm thinking about doing, he stopped. There's no version of this that ends quietly. Logan is going to know I'm coming before I get to that council room. He has people everywhere. He'll have heard about the conversation with Sabrina already. Almost certainly. If he feels cornered, he'll move first. He won't wait for the council meeting. Evelyn picked up her tea. It had gone cold again. She drank it anyway. Then you have less than 8 days. He turned from the window, looked at her with that stripped, raw expression she'd never seen from him before this week, that look of a man who is standing in the wreckage of his own certainties. I need what your investigator has. Everything she has, I need it now. I'll call her, Evelyn said. Evelyn? I said I'll call her. He nodded, reached for his coat, stopped, turned back one more time, and she braced herself for something she didn't want to hear, apology or explanation or the particular male need to narrate one's own reckoning. But what he said was simply, thank you. She didn't answer. He left. She sat in the library with Clara's photograph on her phone screen and the cold tea in her hands and the city moving outside the window and thought about a man who had spent 2 years building the destruction of her marriage as a tactical instrument, who had sat in her kitchen at Christmas and asked about her pregnancy with a smile she now needed to reinterpret entirely. She thought about what it meant that the most dangerous person in this story had never been the one everyone was afraid of. She picked up her phone and called Clara. "I need everything," she said when Clara answered. "Whatever you have, whatever you're still building, I need it formatted and documented and ready to be used in a formal proceeding within 72 hours. "That's fast," Clara said. "I know." A brief silence. "I can do it." "Good." Evelyn stood, moved toward the vault. "Because the man who built all of this just realized we know his name, and a man like that doesn't sit still when he's been found." Clara delivered the full package at 6:40 the following morning. Not digitally. In person, which told Evelyn something about how seriously the woman was taking the exposure risk. She arrived at the penthouse with the leather satchel and flat shoes, and the same contained stillness, and she spread the contents across the library table with the methodical care of someone who had organized evidence for federal prosecution and understood that how you presented information was as important as what the information said. Evelyn stood at the table and looked at it. 14 months of financial transactions routed through 4 shell companies, terminating in accounts connected to 3 of the Blackwood organization's senior captains. Photographs, 11 of them, all time-stamped, all showing Logan Blackwood in meetings with people he had no legitimate reason to be meeting. Phone records. The Meridian Event Services registration traced through 2 layers of ownership to a holding company that shared a registered agent with a logistics subsidiary of Logan's New Jersey operation. A lease agreement for an office space in Hoboken, rented under a name that appeared nowhere else in any public record, but whose signature, when Clara had had it analyzed by a handwriting consultant, was consistent with Logan Blackwood's known signature from corporate filings. And at the center of all of it, a payment record. $40,000 moved in 4 installments across 6 months, from an account connected to Logan's operation to a personal account belonging to Sabrina Cole, beginning 7 months before she had applied for the assistant position at Blackwood Enterprises. Evelyn looked at that document for a long time. "This is enough," she said. "For a counsel proceeding, yes." Clara's voice was measured. "For a federal prosecution, it would need more development, but for establishing the conspiracy in front of an internal audience, yes, this is enough." Evelyn picked up the payment record, held it, thought about a woman who had been paid $40,000 to walk into a man's life and systematically dismantle it, and thought about whether that made Sabrina Cole a villain or an instrument or something in between that didn't have a clean category. Thought about the year, the specific ordinary year of it. "Did Sabrina know the full scope?" she asked. "When Logan recruited her, did she know what the end goal was?" Clara considered the question. "Based on what I've been able to establish, no. She knew she was placed to create a relationship. She knew the relationship was intended to become a public scandal at a specific time. She did not know Logan's plan extended to a full leadership takeover or that he'd been building a parallel criminal network. Her cooperation with your husband suggests she was shocked by the scale of it. Used twice," Evelyn said. "In a sense." She set the payment record down, squared it against the edge of the table. A small, unnecessary gesture, a way of giving her hand something to do while her mind processed. "I'll have Martin courier this to Adrian's attorney this morning, with a full inventory." "There's one more thing," Clara said. Something in her voice made Evelyn look up. Clara reached into the satchel and produced a single sheet of paper. She held it rather than placing it on the table, which was itself a signal. "While I was tracing the Hoboken office lease, I found a secondary file. It was attached to the lease records. Property management companies keep extensive documentation on their tenants, surveillance logs, visitor records. The Hoboken office had a security camera in the lobby." Evelyn waited. "Logan met with someone there 6 weeks ago, someone I didn't initially recognize." Clara set the paper on the table. It was a photograph clearer than the restaurant surveillance shot, lobby camera, better angle. "I ran facial recognition through several databases. The man with Logan is a senior coordinator for the Eastern District Federal Organized Crime Task Force." The room went very quiet. Evelyn looked at the photograph. She looked at it for a long time. The 2 figures in the lobby, the body language between them, not adversarial, not the posture of law enforcement conducting surveillance or making contact with a reluctant witness. Easy. Familiar. The posture of people who have met in this room before and expect to meet again. Logan is working with the federal task force, she said. That's one interpretation. What's another interpretation? Clara was quiet. He's not just trying to take Adrian's position, Evelyn said slowly. He's been feeding information to federal investigators. He's building a case, not against himself, but against the entire Blackwood organization. He plans to hand them everything once he's in charge, as leverage, to make himself untouchable. She looked at Clara. Or he plans to hand them everything and then disappear with whatever he's taken out of the organization's assets. Either scenario is consistent with what I've found, Clara said. Evelyn pressed both hands flat on the table and leaned on them and looked at the document spread in front of her. The evidence she'd spent a week assembling, the carefully constructed case that was supposed to walk into that council room and stop Logan Blackwood before he could destroy what remained of the organization, her father's financial structures had quietly sustained for years. All of it, she understood now, was known to the federal task force, which meant that the moment Logan felt cornered, the moment he realized his timeline had been compromised, he had a nuclear option. He could hand the task force everything he had, accelerate whatever cooperation agreement he'd already built, and walk away from the council meeting entirely while federal agents arrived at the Blackwood organization's door. If Logan knows we're moving against him, she said, he won't wait for the council. No, Clara said. He won't. How quickly can he activate the federal cooperation? I don't know the terms of whatever arrangement he has, but if he's had 6 weeks of meetings, probably quickly. Evelyn straightened. She was very calm, in the way she'd been calm the night she'd watched the kiss on television. The same quality of stillness that came over her when things became extremely clear and extremely terrible simultaneously. She picked up her phone and called Adrian. He answered before the first ring completed. He'd been awake. I need you here, she said. Now. And bring whoever you trust most. Victor Raines arrived with Adrian 40 minutes later. She'd expected one of them to comment on the volume of documents covering the library table. Neither did. Victor looked at it the way she imagined he looked at most things, with a comprehensive, unreadable assessment, and Adrian looked at it the way he'd been looking at everything this week, with that stripped rawness she still hadn't fully adjusted to. She walked them through it methodically. The financial connections, the photographs, the Meridian Trail, the payment records showing Sabrina's recruitment. She gave them time to look at each document, didn't rush them, didn't editorialize. When she got to the lobby photograph, she set it in front of Adrian and let him look at it without saying anything first. He looked at it for a long time. Who is that? He asked. A senior coordinator for the Eastern District Organized Crime Task Force, she said. His name is on the back. Adrian turned the photograph over, read the name, set it face down on the table. Victor picked it up, read it, set it down. The three of them stood in a configuration around the library table, Evelyn at one end, Adrian and Victor on the same side. The document spread between them like a terrain map of something that had already happened and couldn't be prevented, only managed. He's flipped, Victor said. He may not have fully flipped, Evelyn said. He may be maintaining optionality, feeding information selectively to keep himself protected while he builds his position inside the organization. But the moment he's cornered, he hands them everything he has, Adrian said. Yes. Victor sat down heavily in one of the library chairs. I was 63 years old, and he looked it right now, the weight of the calculation visibly pressing on him. How much does he have? Adrian looked at him. A look passed between them. The look of two men who knew the specific answer to that question and were each privately calculating what it meant. He's been embedded for 2 years, Adrian said. He has people in the captain's meetings. He has access to the financial reports that go through the organization's internal review. He stopped, looked at the table. He has enough. Enough to put you away, Victor said. Enough to put all of us away. Evelyn listened to this exchange and felt something settle into place in her chest. Not fear, but the recognition of a changed landscape. This was no longer a story about a public scandal and a marriage that had failed. This was not even a story about a power struggle inside a criminal organization. This was a story about a man who had spent 2 years building a bomb, and the fuse was shorter than any of them had realized. The council meeting is in 6 days, she said. Logan won't wait for it now, Victor said. If he's got any indication we're moving, he doesn't. Not yet. Evelyn looked at them both. Clara Pham is careful. Everything she found without making contact. There's no reason Logan knows his financial trail has been mapped. He knows I talked to Sabrina, Adrian said. Yes. He'll assume I've started investigating. He'll assume I've made progress. But he doesn't know how much progress, Evelyn said. And he doesn't know about Clara, or this documentation, or the lobby photograph. What he knows is that you're looking. He doesn't know what you found. Adrian was quiet for a moment. He'll be watching. Certainly. Every move I make from here will be interpreted. If I pull financial resources, he'll read it. If I call an emergency meeting, he'll read it. If I bring in outside support, any movement you make through the organization's existing channels is visible to him, Evelyn said. You have 3 loyalists in that room, 4 if you count Victor. Every other captain is either bought or uncertain. You can't assemble a majority through the normal process without Logan knowing you're doing it. Victor looked at her. Then how? She'd been thinking about this for the 40 minutes between hanging up the phone and their arrival. She was not a strategist of criminal organizations. She had no experience in the specific architecture of power that the Blackwood Council represented. But she had spent her entire adult life managing the intersection of legitimate and illegitimate finance, understanding how information moved, and building structures designed to withstand exactly the kind of systematic dismantling Logan had been attempting. She thought she knew how it needed to work. You can't assemble the case through the organization, she said, but the council has one rule that supersedes all others, one mechanism that Logan can't interfere with through his bought captains, because it doesn't require a majority vote. It requires only a formal accusation of treason against the organization, presented with evidence by a recognized party. Victor was looking at her differently now. Not the way he'd looked at her when he'd called her to deliver the information about the captains, the careful, slightly condescending regard of a man managing a delicate civilian. Something closer to the way he looked at Adrian when Adrian said something that changed the shape of a problem. A formal accusation requires the accuser to face the council directly, he said. I know. That means being in the room. I know. If Logan has even 2 of the captains fully committed to him, if he can disrupt the proceeding, then it fails, she said. I understand the risk. Adrian had been watching this exchange. Now he said, You're not going into that room. She looked at him. I'm the only one who can bring the accusation. You're the subject of the leadership challenge. You can't be the accuser. Victor isn't a principal member of the council. Martin can provide legal documentation, but he's an outsider. I am... She paused. Chose the precise word. I am Evelyn Harrington Blackwood. Whatever is in the process of changing about that name, in the eyes of the council's rules, I am a recognized party. You're 11 weeks pregnant. I'm aware of that. Evelyn, if we do nothing, she said levelly, without heat, Logan activates his federal arrangement within the week. Possibly sooner. The organization collapses under federal indictment. The assets are frozen, including the ones that are legally mine and our child's, and Logan walks away protected under whatever cooperation agreement he's built. She looked at him steadily. If we move through the council with documented evidence, we have a chance to stop him before he can trigger the federal peace. The moment he's formally accused in front of the full council with evidence in hand, his leverage disappears, because whatever he hands the federal task force after that point becomes retaliation, not cooperation. And that distinction, Victor was looking at her with something she couldn't fully name. You've thought about this carefully, he said. I've had a week of very long nights, she said. Adrian stood up. He walked away from the table, the same thing he'd done the night before, moving to the window, needing space around him when something was too large to process at a table. He stood with his back to them and his hands in his pockets and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, If Logan finds out what we're planning before the council, he can't find out. How do we guarantee that? We don't move through the organization at all. No captain is informed until they walk into the council room. The accusation is filed directly with the council's chair, Caruso, who has never been bought by anyone because buying him would be more trouble than it's worth, and the council is convened without a stated agenda. Victor straightened. Caruso is old line. He'll convene for a recognized party's formal accusation without revealing the reason. Yes, Evelyn said. But if Logan has people watching Caruso, then we're out of options anyway. She looked at Victor directly. Is there a version of this that has no risk? He looked back at her for a long moment. Then he shook his head. Then we work with the version we have, she said. The call to Caruso was made through a channel so old it nearly predated Adrian's leadership, a contact protocol established in the organization's founding documents that had never been digitized, and that Logan, in his 2 years of careful information gathering, had apparently never found. Victor made it from a landline. Evelyn stood in the doorway of the library and listened to the short, formal exchange, the clipped and specific language of a world that had its own grammar, and felt the weight of what she was setting in motion. Caruso agreed to convene in 4 days. That gave Logan 2 days fewer than he'd planned for. That night, after Adrian and Victor had gone, Evelyn sat in the library and looked at the documents spread across the table and allowed herself, for the first time in 10 days, to feel the full volume of what was happening. Not process it, feel it. The difference between those two things had been sustaining her, she understood, but it had also been accumulating somewhere, building up behind the controlled surface like water behind a dam. She pressed both hands flat on the table. She thought about her father, thought about Elias Harrington sitting in this same room. He'd sat in this room often, in the years before he died, working through financial documents in the specific lamplight that made the library feel like a room out of time, and thought about what he would say about what she was doing. He'd been a careful man, a man who'd built his entire life around the principle that the best protection was preparation, and that preparation meant never being surprised by what the documents said. He would say she'd been prepared. He would also say she'd waited too long to read them. She breathed. Let the feeling move through her, grief and fury and the specific grinding exhaustion of 10 days of sustained alertness. And then she put it back. Not away. Back. To the place where things went when they needed to wait until there was time for them. She picked up her phone and called Martin. "We're moving on the council," she said when he answered. "I need you to formally certify the documentation as legally admissible for an internal proceeding. Can you have it done in 48 hours? Martin was quiet for a moment. "Yes." "Evelyn, are you going to be the one presenting it?" "Yes." A long pause. "I'll be there with you." "I know you will," she said. "That's why I'm calling you." She hung up and sat in the quiet library for a while longer. Then her phone buzzed, a text from a number she didn't recognize. No name, no introduction, just, "You should ask your husband what happened in Baltimore in 2019. She stared at the message. Read it again. Baltimore, 2019. She ran the year through her memory, where she'd been, what had been happening, what she remembered Adrian being occupied with. 2019 had been a difficult year for the organization. She'd known that in the abstract peripheral way she knew most organizational business. Overhearing fragments, noticing when Adrian's schedule compressed, registering the quality of his tension without asking about its source. There had been something in Baltimore. She'd asked once, and he'd said it was resolved, and she'd accepted that. She'd accepted a lot. She was understanding now. She looked at the number. Untraceable, almost certainly. Burner or routed. She typed back. "Who is this?" The 3 dots appeared immediately, as if whoever it was had been watching the screen. Then, "Someone who knows what Logan has that you don't." Her hand was very steady on the phone. She'd noticed that about herself during this past week, that her hand stayed steady during the moments when everything else was moving. What does Logan have? A pause. Longer this time. Long enough that she wondered if the conversation was over. Then, evidence from Baltimore that Adrian approved the destruction of a federal witness protection asset. 3 people died. Logan documented it. That's his insurance policy, not just organizational records. Murder. Your husband is looking at life if Logan hands that file over. Evelyn set the phone down on the table. She looked at the documents spread in front of her. The careful, methodical architecture of evidence she'd spent 10 days assembling. The plan she'd spent 40 minutes constructing. The council meeting in 4 days. All of it was built on a foundation she hadn't known was unstable. If what this message said was true, if Logan held documentation connecting Adrian to the deaths of 3 people in a federal witness protection asset, then the council meeting changed entirely. It wasn't just about organizational power anymore. Walking into that room with the evidence she had, exposing Logan, might not save Adrian. It might simply trigger whatever Logan had on him. A desperate man with life imprisonment on the table had nothing left to lose by burning everything. She picked up the phone again. She needed to know if it was true. She called Adrian. He answered in 2 rings. What happened? She read him the text messages, word for word, no editorializing. The silence that followed lasted long enough that she counted it. 12 seconds. Adrian, she said, I need you to tell me if it's true. Another silence, shorter, but the quality of it told her everything before he said a word. It wasn't authorized the way he's describing it, he said. That's not what I asked. Evelyn, did people die? The pause was 3 seconds. Yes. She closed her eyes briefly, opened them. The library was exactly the same, the lamp, the documents, the city outside the window, and completely different. 3 people. 2 agents and a civilian informant. The operation in Baltimore went wrong. It was... He stopped. Started again, his voice stripped and careful. There were decisions made in the field that I was informed of after the fact. Whether Logan can document prior knowledge on my part. I don't know what he has. You don't know what he has? No. She stood up. She moved away from the table, away from the documents, away from the carefully organized evidence that now felt like a structure built on sand, and stood in the middle of the library and breathed. Someone just told me, she said. Someone who knows what Logan's holding. Someone who sent me an anonymous text from a burner phone at 10:30 at night because they wanted me to know before the council meeting. Who? I don't know. She looked at the phone in her hand. But they knew the right thing to tell me. They knew exactly what would change the shape of everything. Adrian was quiet. Someone is feeding us information, she said. Someone who knows Logan's full hand. And I don't know if they're doing it because they want to help us or because they want to watch what happens when we know. A third player, Adrian said. Yes. The word hung between them on the line, the recognition of a game that was more complex than either of them had mapped. Not 2 sides, not a conspiracy and a counter-conspiracy, but something triangulated and unstable and deeply, specifically dangerous. We can't go into that council room, he said. Not now. If Logan has the Baltimore file, we have to go into that council room, she said. If we don't, he hands everything to the task force, and the question of the Baltimore file becomes academic because you'll be answering for it in federal court anyway. Evelyn, there is no safe choice left. Her voice came out harder than she'd intended. Not angry, just stripped. The bare fact of it. Everything you built, everything my father built, everything that belongs to our child, it's all in the same room in 4 days. Whatever Logan has, however bad it is, the only chance any of it survives is if we walk into that room and we are better prepared than he is. Adrian was silent for a long time. When he spoke, his voice had a quality she'd never heard from him before. Not the controlled authority she'd known for 6 years, not the stripped rawness of the past week. Something underneath both of those. Something older. I don't know how to protect you if this goes wrong. She thought about that honestly, about what protection had looked like in the previous version of her life, and what it would look like in whatever came next. You don't need to protect me, she said. I need you to trust me to protect myself. He said nothing. Find out who sent that text, she said. I'll handle Martin. We have 4 days. She ended the call. She stood in the library with the phone in her hand and the documents on the table and the city outside and the child she was carrying, 11 weeks, a heartbeat she'd seen on a screen, a person who did not yet know what world they were being born into. And she understood that every decision she'd made in the past 10 days had been preparation for something she hadn't fully understood yet. She was not the woman Logan Blackwood had written off when he'd spent 2 years building his plan. She was not the decorative wife the captains had protected from difficult information. She was not the quiet figure in the background of a man's empire. She was the person who had read every footnote, who had kept the vault combination to herself, who had spent 48 hours turning a week's worth of financial threads into a documented case that had the power to end what Logan had built. And she was the person who was going to have to walk into a room full of men who controlled a criminal empire in 4 days, 11 weeks pregnant, and dismantle a conspiracy that had federal dimensions she was only beginning to understand. She squared the documents on the library table. She turned off the lamp. She walked to the vault. She was going to need to know everything, not just what she had, but what she didn't have, and what the space between those two things might cost her and everyone else in that room. She opened the vault door, and in the small, specific light of her father's careful construction, She began to prepare for the worst version of what was coming. The third day before the council meeting, someone tried to get into the penthouse. Not a forced entry. A key card. A duplicate of the building's master access. The kind that required either significant money or significant leverage to obtain. The building's security system logged the attempt at 2:14 in the morning. Elevator called to the penthouse floor. Keycard swiped. Access denied because Evelyn had asked building management to change the penthouse lock protocol 4 days ago, and they'd complied within the hour. She found the log entry at 6 a.m. when she checked the overnight security report, a habit she'd started the night she'd received the anonymous text, checking everything, reading every footnote, trusting nothing that hadn't been personally verified. She sat with the log entry and her cold ginger tea and understood that the timeline had just compressed again. Logan knew they were moving. She called Victor at 6:15. He answered on the first ring, which meant he hadn't been sleeping either. Someone tried to access the penthouse at 2 a.m., she said. Building security denied it. I need Adrian moved. I'll handle it. Now, Victor. I understand. Now. A pause. She could hear him already moving, the particular sound of a large man putting on shoes quickly. Are you staying in the penthouse? She thought about it for 3 seconds. Yes. Moving me draws more attention. The penthouse security is solid. I'll have Martin send someone. I can send someone. Martin's people don't know what you know. That makes them safer to use right now. She paused. Find out who tried to come up here. That keycard was issued somewhere. Already on it, Victor said, and hung up. She dressed carefully, not because she anticipated being seen today, but because the act of doing it precisely, each button in order, helped her think. She ate breakfast standing at the kitchen counter. Toast, half an avocado, a glass of water she made herself finish. The baby needed her to eat. That was a fact she kept returning to when the adrenaline tried to replace everything else. The baby needed her to sleep and eat and keep her blood pressure from doing something catastrophic, and those physical requirements were, paradoxically, the most stabilizing thing in her current landscape. At 8 a.m., Clara Pham called. I found the source of the anonymous text, she said without preamble. Evelyn set down her water glass. Who? Sabrina Cole. The name landed differently than it would have a week ago. Not as the woman from the television Kiss. As a person who had, according to the pattern Evelyn was beginning to understand, been used in ways that exceeded anything she'd agreed to and had apparently decided at some point that her survival required switching sides. Sabrina sent me the text, Evelyn said. From a burner, yes. I traced the device purchase, cash transaction, but the store had camera footage. It's her. She knew about the Baltimore file. She told me, Clara paused. She contacted me directly this morning. She said she wants to talk to you. Evelyn thought about this. When? She said whenever you're willing. She said she knows what Logan has on Adrian, and she knows things about the Baltimore operation that aren't in any document Logan holds. Things that help or things that hurt. She said things that changed the shape of it. Claire's voice was careful. I can't evaluate that without knowing what she knows. But my read on her, she's scared. She's not running a play. She's trying to get out from under something that got bigger than she expected. Where is she? Hotel in Midtown. She checked in under a different name 3 days ago. Evelyn looked at the window. Gray morning light, the city doing its relentless thing. She thought about the council meeting in 3 days, about the Baltimore file and the federal task force coordinator in Logan's lobby photograph, about a woman who'd been paid $40,000 to walk into a man's life and had apparently not understood, until it was too late, what she was actually part of. Set up the meeting, she said. Neutral location, this afternoon. Understood. Clara. She paused. Come with me. What? The hotel cafe was the kind of place that was intentionally unmemorable. Beige walls, round tables, a lunch crowd of business travelers who were looking at their phones and not at each other. Sabrina Cole was sitting at a corner table with her back to the wall, a cup of coffee in front of her that she hadn't touched, wearing clothes that looked like she'd bought them recently and in a hurry. She looked smaller than she had on television. That was Evelyn's first involuntary thought, that the woman from the gala footage had occupied space differently, with the particular physical confidence of someone who knew she was being watched and had made her peace with it. This woman was trying to take up as little space as possible. Evelyn sat down across from her. Clara took the adjacent table, close enough. Sabrina looked at Evelyn for a moment without speaking. Her eyes moved to Evelyn's midsection, the barely visible evidence of the pregnancy, visible only if you were looking, and something crossed her face that was too complicated to name cleanly. Not guilt exactly, the look of someone confronting the full weight of a consequence they'd understood theoretically and were now seeing in physical form. "I'm sorry," Sabrina said. I know it doesn't fix anything." "It doesn't," Evelyn agreed. "Tell me about Baltimore." Sabrina wrapped both hands around her untouched coffee cup. Her knuckles were pale. "Logan has surveillance recordings from the Baltimore operation. Audio. He's been holding them for 2 years. He got them through one of his contacts inside a private security firm that was running parallel surveillance on the same target the organization was moving against." She looked at the table. "The recordings have Adrian giving the order to eliminate the target regardless of collateral. Collateral meaning the federal assets." "Yes. And you heard these recordings?" Sabrina looked up. "Logan played them for me 6 months ago when I started having doubts. He was establishing what he called mutual accountability, showing me that everyone in this was dirty and the only way through was to stay the course." Her jaw tightened. "He was making sure I understood what happened to people who developed a conscience at the wrong time." Evelyn looked at her steadily. "Are the recordings authentic?" A pause, long enough that Evelyn felt the shape of it. "I don't know," Sabrina said. "I think I've thought about this a lot. Logan is very good at building things that look real. The payment structures he set up for the captains he bought, the shell companies, the manufactured documentation, everything he builds is detailed enough to survive casual scrutiny. But I've never been able to independently verify the Baltimore recordings. I only have his word that they're authentic." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "He could have manufactured them." "Yes." "He has the resources, the contacts, the technical capacity." "Yes." "And if the recordings are fabricated, then the leverage he thinks he has on Adrian is a bluff," Sabrina said. "A very sophisticated 2-year-old bluff." She looked at Evelyn directly. "But here's the thing, I can't prove they're fake, and neither can you. And if he walks that material into the Federal Task Force's office, the investigators don't need them to be authentic to use them. They need them to be persuasive enough to justify a deeper investigation. And once that investigation starts, everything else Logan has given them becomes the foundation for a real case," Evelyn said. "Yes." Evelyn sat back. She was thinking about the shape of what Sabrina had just given her. Not a solution, not a clean path, but a specific piece of information that changed the texture of what she was walking into. The Baltimore recordings might be real or fabricated. Logan might know which and be running a bluff, or he might have manufactured the recordings so carefully that even he'd half convinced himself of their authenticity. Either way, he would use them. Either way, she had to find a way to neutralize them before he could. "You said you know things that changed the shape of the Baltimore situation," Evelyn said. "What things?" Sabrina exhaled. "There was a man in the organization, lower level, ran logistics coordination for the East Coast operation. His name was Paul Duran. He was present in Baltimore, not as a decision maker, as a driver, essentially. He saw what happened from a position Logan's surveillance wouldn't have captured." "Where is he now?" "He left the organization 14 months ago. He's living in Connecticut, private life, completely separated. Logan doesn't know he exists in any significant capacity because Duran was too low level to be on Logan's map." She looked at Evelyn carefully. "But Duran knows what actually happened in Baltimore. He knows who gave the orders and in what sequence and whether what Logan's recordings appear to show is consistent with what actually occurred. He's a witness. A reluctant one. He left the organization because he wanted nothing more to do with any of it. But he's not in danger from Logan because Logan has no idea he matters." She paused. "He might talk to you." "Why would he talk to me?" "Because you're not the organization. You're a woman who's trying to protect her child from a situation that's been built around her without her knowledge." Sabrina's voice was flat and specific, stripped of anything performative. "He has a daughter, 14 years old. He got out of this life for her. If you tell him the truth, that a fabricated document might send an innocent man to prison and collapse a structure that employs people who had nothing to do with any of this, he might talk." Evelyn looked at her for a long moment. "You've already contacted him." Sabrina held her gaze. I called him last week. I told him what was coming. He said he'd wait to see if you reached out. The cafe noise continued around them. Coffee machines, low conversation, the specific mundane hum of people who were not in the middle of what Evelyn was in the middle of. She thought about adding another variable to an already complex equation with 2 days until the council meeting. Thought about what it meant to build a case on the testimony of a reluctant former logistics coordinator in Connecticut. Thought about what it meant not to. "Give me his contact information," she said. Paul Duren lived in a small house in Westport, 40 minutes from the city. Evelyn drove herself, which Clara had objected to and which Evelyn had overruled on the grounds that arriving with any visible security apparatus would remind Duren of exactly what he'd spent 14 months trying to leave behind. She drove carefully, both hands on the wheel, the city thinning out into suburban distance, and she thought about what she was going to say to a man who had no reason to walk back into the thing he'd escaped. He was waiting on the front steps when she pulled up. 50-something, the kind of face that had probably been harder before life outside the organization had softened it slightly. He was holding a coffee mug in both hands, and he watched her walk up the front path with the expression of a man who has decided something and is waiting to see if the decision was correct. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said. "Evelyn." He looked at her for a moment. Then he stood up and held the door open. "Come in." The house was ordinary in the way that felt intentional, the specific ordinary of someone who had chosen it as a statement. Clean, modestly furnished, a child's homework on the kitchen table, a school photograph on the refrigerator, a 14-year-old girl with her father's eyes grinning at a camera. Duren sat across from her at the kitchen table and didn't offer anything except the truth, which he gave in the flat, precise language of someone who had rehearsed it many times in his own head and was relieved, in a complicated way, to be saying it out loud. The Baltimore operation, he told her, had gone wrong because of a timing failure, not an order. The target had moved earlier than intelligence indicated. The field team had made a decision in the moment, not Adrian's decision, not any decision that came from the top. And the federal assets had been in the wrong location at the wrong time. Adrian had been informed afterward. His response, documented in the private security firm's surveillance, had been fury, not instruction. The recordings Logan held were authentic, but their context was stripped. What sounded like an order was, in its full form, a reaction to news of what had already happened. Duren had been there. He had heard the full exchange. "You'd swear to this," Evelyn said. "In front of the council." He looked at his coffee mug, at the school photograph on the refrigerator, back at Evelyn. "I got out so my daughter doesn't grow up knowing what her father did for a living," he said. Walking back into that room, "I know what I'm asking." He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she didn't push. She waited him out the way she waited out every silence, with the specific patience of someone who understood that the space between words was where real decisions happened. "One time," he said finally, "I walk in that room one time, I say what I saw, and then I'm done. Completely done. No follow-up, no further involvement, no name in any document that could surface later. Martin Reeves will draft a confidentiality agreement before you enter that room. Your name will not appear in any organizational record." He nodded slowly. "Okay." She drove back to the city in the failing afternoon light and called Adrian. "I have a witness for Baltimore," she said. "I need you to tell me before we go any further if his account exonerates you." She told him what Duren had said. The silence on the other end was different from every other silence she'd navigated this week. It had relief in it, raw, exhausted, almost painful relief. "That's what happened," Adrian said. "That's exactly what happened." "Then we have a chance," she said. "But Adrian, we're out of time. If Logan finds out about Duren or about Sabrina meeting with me, he moves tonight. We have to go to that council room tomorrow, not in 3 days. Tomorrow." Caruso agreed to 4 days. "I know. Call him again. Tell him it's urgent. Tell him whatever the right thing to say to a man like Caruso is. We cannot give Logan another night to maneuver." She heard Adrian exhale. "If we rush this and we're not ready—" "We're ready," she said. "We're as ready as we're going to be." She stopped at a red light and looked at the city and felt the full weight of the next 24 hours settling onto her shoulders with a physical specificity. "I'll be in that room tomorrow with the documents, with Sabrina's sworn statement, and with Paul Duren. You bring Victor and whatever 2 other captains you're certain of. Caruso controls the room. And we end this." A long pause. Are you sure about this? I'm sure that Logan tried to get into my apartment 2 nights ago, she said. I'm sure that he has a federal task force contact he can activate at any time. I'm sure that waiting gives him advantages and moving gives us them. The light changed. She drove. I'm not sure about anything else, but those things are enough. The council room was on the fourth floor of a building in Lower Manhattan that publicly housed an import consulting firm and that the Blackwood organization had operated out of for 11 years. Evelyn had never been inside it. She'd known it existed the way she knew many things about the organization, in the abstract, as a fact she'd registered and filed without needing its details. She arrived at 7:45 the following morning. Victor met her at the building entrance. He looked like he'd slept in his clothes, which he probably had. He looked at her face and at the document case she was carrying and said nothing, which she appreciated. The room itself was smaller than she'd imagined. A long table, 12 chairs, wood paneling that belonged to an earlier decade, a window that looked out on the back of the adjacent building's brick wall. 8 captains were already seated when she walked in. 3 more came in behind her. Caruso, who was 77 years old and looked like a man who had outlasted several iterations of everyone in the room, sat at the head of the table with his hands folded and his face configured in an expression of absolute, impenetrable neutrality. Logan was already there. He was sitting 4 seats from Caruso's right, and when Evelyn walked in, he looked at her with an expression she catalogued quickly. Surprise, immediately suppressed. Then calculation. Then a very fast, very controlled version of the smile he'd used at her wedding, at Christmas dinners, at every occasion where he'd been managing the impression he made. He hadn't expected her. That told her their security had held. She sat down without looking at him again. She set the document case on the table in front of her. Martin Reeves came in behind her and sat at her left. Victor took the seat at her right. Adrian entered last and took the chair directly across from Logan and sat down and looked at his cousin with an expression that had no performance in it whatsoever. Caruso said, "We're called for a formal accusation. Under the rules of this council, the accusing party will be heard without interruption. Then the accused will respond. Then we deliberate." He looked around the table. His voice had the particular authority of a man who had never needed to raise it. "We begin." Evelyn opened the document case. She'd rehearsed this. Not the words, she didn't work from scripts, but the structure. The order in which the evidence would be presented, the logic of how each piece connected to the next, the moments where she would pause and let the room absorb what they'd heard before moving forward. She'd rehearsed it in the vault at 2 in the morning with her father's lamp on and the city dark outside. She stood up. "My name is Evelyn Harrington," she said. "I appear before this council as a recognized party with standing to make a formal accusation of conspiracy against the Blackwood organization by one of its members." She looked at Caruso, not at Logan. "The accusation is against Logan Blackwood, and the evidence I'm presenting has been documented, legally certified, and independently verified." She began. She walked them through it in order: the Meridian Event Services authorization, the financial connections to Logan's shell companies, the payment records showing Sabrina's recruitment. She laid the documents out as she spoke, one at a time, face up on the table, pushing them toward the center so that every captain could see them. She spoke in plain language, without legal jargon, without drama, just the facts and the documents that supported them, connected by the logical thread that made them a single coherent picture. Logan didn't move for the first 15 minutes. He sat with his hands in front of him on the table, relaxed, the posture of a man who is prepared for something and is waiting for the part where his preparation becomes relevant. She felt his eyes on her the entire time. She didn't look at him. When she reached the lobby photograph, the image of Logan and the Federal Task Force coordinator, she placed it in the center of the table and said, "Logan Blackwood has been cooperating with the Eastern District Organized Crime Task Force for a minimum of 6 weeks. He has been feeding organizational information to federal investigators as part of an arrangement designed to give him legal protection when he moves to assume leadership. His intention was not to lead this organization. His intention was to dismantle it from the inside while ensuring his own immunity." The room had been quiet before. Now it became a different kind of quiet. Logan moved for the first time. He leaned forward. "That photograph." "You'll have your opportunity to respond," Caruso said. 1 sentence. Logan sat back. Evelyn reached the Baltimore section last. She'd thought carefully about how to present it. Not as an exoneration, She wasn't here to defend Adrian, and presenting it that way would undermine the credibility of everything else she'd laid out. She presented it as evidence of the method. Logan's deliberate use of decontextualized information to manufacture leverage, the same technique he'd applied to the affair, to the financial structures, to the captain payments. A man who built false pictures from true materials. When she finished laying out the documented case, she said, "I have two witnesses. The first has given a sworn statement that I'll now enter into the record." She slid Sabrina's notarized statement toward Caruso. "The second is present and will speak for himself." She looked at the door. Paul Duren had been waiting in the hallway. Victor had arranged it, a detail she'd asked him to handle without explaining to Adrian, because she'd needed at least one element of this to move without going through the organization's channels. Duren came in looking like a man walking into a place he'd sworn he'd never return to, which was exactly what he was. He sat in the chair Victor pulled out for him at the end of the table, and he looked at no one except Evelyn. "Tell them what you told me," she said. "Exactly what you told me." He did. He spoke for 8 minutes. Flat, specific, without embellishment. The sequence of events in Baltimore, the timing failure, the field decision, the moment when Adrian had received the news of what had already happened. He spoke like a man who has rehearsed the truth rather than a story, which is a different quality and one that rooms full of experienced people tend to recognize. When he finished, the room was very still. Logan's calm, Evelyn noticed, had developed a crack. Small. At the jawline. The specific tightening of a man who is revising his calculations in real time and not finding the numbers working in his favor. He'd expected the documents, possibly even the lobby photograph. He might have anticipated that an investigation would find it eventually. But Duren he hadn't expected. Duren existed below his operational radar, and the 8 minutes of testimony had just severed the only piece of leverage that might have survived everything else Evelyn had presented. Caruso said, "Logan Blackwood, you may respond." Logan stood up. He was good. She had to acknowledge that, watching him. He was very good. He stood with the relaxed authority of a man who has never been in a room he couldn't manage, and he looked at the captains around the table with the particular expression of someone who is about to reframe everything they've just seen. "What you've been shown," he said, "is a case assembled by a woman who has a personal interest in protecting her husband, a woman who is, with respect to Evelyn Harrington." He used her maiden name deliberately, and she watched the calculation in it, the attempt to diminish the standing she'd invoked at the opening. Not a member of this organization, not someone with direct knowledge of how this organization operates. Someone who came in from outside and built a narrative from financial documents she found online and photographs her private investigator took from public spaces. He was moving his eyes around the table, reading faces, adjusting. "The photograph of me at a building in Hoboken. Yes, I met with a federal contact. Once. Because I was being approached and I needed to understand the scope of their investigation so I could protect this organization. That is not cooperation. That is intelligence gathering." He paused. Let that sit. She could see it working on two of the captains at the far end of the table. A slight shift, a reconsideration. Logan saw it too. The financial documents she's presented are taken from transactions that have legitimate explanations within the context of operations I was running with organizational approval. The payments to Sabrina Cole were payments to an informant I was using to investigate a competitor operation. He spread his hands. "I understand how this looks assembled the way she's assembled it. But what you're looking at is a wife protecting her husband by building a false case against the only person who's been trying to protect this organization from federal scrutiny." He sat down. Evelyn hadn't moved during his response. She'd been watching the room, the faces, the micro-adjustments, the way the balance shifted when a skilled person spoke to a room full of people who were predisposed to prefer a narrative that didn't require them to acknowledge they'd been bought. Logan was good. 2 of the captains were moving back toward him, possibly 3. She needed to decide in the next 30 seconds whether to let it go to deliberation or to do the thing she'd held back. She looked at Caruso. "I have one more piece of evidence," she said. Logan's jaw tightened. Caruso nodded. She reached into the document case and removed a single folder. Inside was not a document. It was a transcript, prepared by Clara Pham overnight, from audio that Sabrina had recorded on her personal phone during a meeting with Logan 8 days ago, 3 days before the gala. The audio was raw and imperfect and completely unambiguous. Logan's voice, explaining to Sabrina in precise detail what would happen after Adrian was removed from the council, what Logan's federal arrangement would mean for the organization's assets, and what happened to people who decided, at the wrong moment, that they had a conscience. She had not told Adrian about the recording. She had not told Victor. She had told only Martin, when she'd had him certify it at midnight. She set the transcript on the table and said, "This is a transcript of audio recorded by Sabrina Cole on the 8th of this month. The original audio file is in the possession of my attorney and has been submitted to a secure third-party depository with instructions to release it to federal authorities if anything happens to any person connected to this proceeding." She paused. "I'll give everyone a moment to read the relevant section, which begins at page 2. The room read. She watched Logan. His hands were flat on the table, completely still. His face had settled into something that wasn't the controlled public expression anymore. Wasn't the charming cousin. Wasn't the prepared defendant. It was the face of a man who has just understood that he is lost, and who is now doing the arithmetic of what that means. Victor's hand moved under the table, a small gesture. She didn't look at it, but she registered it. The organizational signal for a captain who had been Logan's most visible supporter, the one she'd been most worried about, pushing back from the table slightly, separating himself. The room's balance had shifted. Caruso looked up from the transcript. He looked at Logan Blackwood with the impenetrable expression of a 77-year-old man who has seen the full range of what people do when they're cornered. He said, "Logan Blackwood, you are directed to remain in this room." Logan stood up anyway. "Sit down." The voice came from behind him, a captain named Reyes, who had 30 years in the organization and had been silent for the entire proceeding, and who now stood with his hands at his sides with an unmistakable quality of intention. "Sit down, Logan." Logan looked at Reyes, at the door, at the captains around the table who were all, now, looking at him with the specific expression of men who have made a collective decision. At Adrian, who was sitting perfectly still across the table with his hands folded and his eyes on his cousin and nothing in his face that could be called triumph. Logan sat down. Evelyn closed the document case. Her hands were shaking. She noticed it only now, the sustained adrenaline of the past 90 minutes finally expressing itself in the fine tremor she'd been suppressing since she walked through the door. She pressed her palms flat on the table and kept her face exactly where it needed to be. The room erupted. Not loudly, these were not men who shouted, mostly, but the eruption of controlled voices all moving at once, the specific chaos of 11 captains and an accused man and a formal accusation that had just been confirmed in the most concrete possible terms, had its own volume. Caruso's hand came down on the table once, flat, and the room went quiet. "Deliberation will be held," Caruso said. "All principles will remain. The council will—" The door opened. It wasn't Victor's men. It wasn't building security. It was 3 men in the particular suits that Evelyn, who had spent 20 years adjacent to federal investigations, recognized immediately and viscerally. The cut, the ID badges coming out, the practiced movement of people who had rehearsed an entry. Federal agents. Evelyn's first thought was Logan's arrangement, that he'd activated it somehow, signaled through a channel she hadn't anticipated, and that everything she'd built in the past 90 minutes was about to be buried under federal jurisdiction. Her second thought arrived 1 beat later, as the lead agent looked not at Adrian but directly at Logan Blackwood and said, "Logan Blackwood, we have sealed indictments." The room went absolutely still. Logan looked at the agents, at the indictments folder the lead agent was holding, at Evelyn, one long, specific look, the look of a man who is trying to understand the mechanism of how he was beaten and is running out of time to figure it out. She looked back at him steadily. She hadn't called the federal task force. She hadn't known about sealed indictments. But Clara Pham, in the 48 hours before this meeting, had been doing more than organizing documents. She'd been following the money trails to their terminus, and 2 of those trails had led to financial crimes that existed independently of Logan's organizational conspiracy, and that Clara, as a former federal agent with current contacts, had flagged to the appropriate people. The arrest was not Evelyn's design, but it was the consequence of her work. Logan's attorney, who had been sitting in the lobby of this building waiting for a call that had not come, was at that moment, as Evelyn would learn later, sitting across from federal prosecutors and accepting the terms of a cooperation agreement that he'd been quietly negotiating for 6 weeks. having made his own calculation about which side of this story he needed to be on. Logan looked at Evelyn one more time as the agents moved toward him. She watched his face. She didn't look away. She let him see whatever he was going to see. Not triumph, not relief, not the satisfaction of having won. Just a woman who had read the footnotes and followed the money and done what needed to be done. The captain named Reyes moved aside. The agents moved through the space he'd created. And Logan Blackwood, who had spent 22 months building the most careful, patient, sophisticated plan anyone in that room had ever witnessed, put his hands behind his back and let them put the cuffs on in front of every captain in the Blackwood organization. The room did not erupt again. It was quieter than that. Evelyn sat in her chair with her hands flat on the table and her document case closed in front of her and felt the specific weight of what had just happened. Not resolution, not yet, but the moment just before resolution, the held breath before the last thing falls into place. She was very tired. She was also 12 weeks pregnant, in a room full of men who had just watched her dismantle a 22-month conspiracy with documents and a recording and a retired logistics coordinator from Westport, Connecticut. She looked at Adrian across the table. He was looking at her with that expression she kept not having a name for. The thing underneath the rawness, the thing older than authority or grief. He started to say something. She shook her head slightly. Not here. Not in front of these men, in this room, with Logan's empty chair between them and the sound of the federal agent's footsteps fading down the hallway. Later. She looked back at Caruso, who was watching her with the closest thing to surprise she suspected his face was capable of producing. I believe, she said quietly, the council has what it needs to complete its deliberation. The council room emptied slowly. Not the way rooms empty after ordinary meetings, people gathering papers, checking phones, the ordinary friction of bodies moving toward exits. It emptied the way rooms empty after something has permanently altered the landscape of everyone in them. Carefully. With the specific awareness of men who are recalibrating everything they thought they understood about the past 2 years. Caruso was the last captain to leave. He stopped at the door and looked back at Evelyn, who was still sitting at the table with her document case in front of her and her hands folded on top of it. He looked at her for a long moment with those impenetrable eyes that had witnessed 11 years of this organization's internal history, and said, simply, "Your father was a good man." She hadn't expected that. "Yes," she said. "He was." Caruso left. The room was empty then except for Evelyn and Adrian and Victor, who was standing near the window looking out at the brick wall of the adjacent building with his hands in his pockets, and the posture of a man who is giving 2 people space they haven't asked for yet, but clearly need. Adrian was still at the table. He hadn't moved from his chair since the agents had taken Logan out. I was looking at the surface of the table in front of him, the empty space where the documents had been, cleared now, just the wood grain and the particular light of a room that had held something enormous, and was now, somehow, ordinary again. Evelyn picked up her document case. "I'm going home," she said. Adrian looked up. "Can I—" He stopped, started again. "I'd like to talk." "Not here." She thought about it. She was exhausted in a way that went past physical, past the accumulated sleeplessness of the past 12 days, into something structural, the specific depletion of a person who has been operating at maximum capacity for too long, and whose body is now, in the absence of immediate crisis, presenting the bill. Her back ached. Her feet ached. The baby, indifferent to the architecture of criminal conspiracy, had been pressing against her lower abdomen all morning with the relentless physical insistence of a life that didn't care about any of it. "Not tonight," she said. "Give me tonight." He nodded. He didn't argue. Whatever he'd lost in the past 2 weeks, the impulse to argue with her when she said something plainly and meant it appeared to have been among it. Victor drove her home. They didn't speak in the car, which she appreciated. Victor Raines had spent 30 years in a world where the ability to be useful without requiring acknowledgement was a survival skill, and he applied it now with the same reliability he applied everything else. He pulled up to the building. He waited while she got out. He said, "I'll have someone on the lobby tonight," and she said thank you, and that was the entire conversation. She went upstairs. She stood in the middle of the penthouse for a moment after the elevator doors closed, just stood, in the entrance, in her coat, with the document case still in her hand, and let the silence of the place move through her. It was 11:20 in the morning. Outside, the city was doing its thing. Inside, everything was exactly as she'd left it, and completely different, because she was different, and the particular way a space feels is always a function of the person standing in it. She put the document case down. She took off her coat. She went to the kitchen and made ginger tea, and this time she drank it warm. Bob. Martin called at 2 in the afternoon. Logan's attorney formally filed the cooperation agreement with the Eastern District an hour ago, he said. They're negotiating the terms now. Logan will be held pending arraignment. A pause. Clara's documentation formed the basis for 2 of the 3 indictment counts. The third came from the task force's own investigation, which Logan had apparently been inadvertently feeding through his selective disclosures. His own intelligence gathering came back on him, Evelyn said. Spectacularly. Martin's voice had a dry quality she recognized as the closest he came to satisfaction. The federal contact in the lobby photograph, the task force coordinator, is under internal review. It appears Logan's relationship with him was less sanctioned cooperation and more a private arrangement that the coordinator was running without his supervisor's knowledge. Logan thought he had a federal shield, she said, and the man providing it was freelancing. That appears to be the case. She thought about the specific irony of that. A man who had spent 2 years building a protection structure that turned out to be built on the same kind of illusion he'd used to build everything else. What about the organization? The cooperation agreement Logan's attorney filed covers Logan's own activities. He's not in a position to provide comprehensive organizational intelligence. He was never formally inside the operational structure, and the captains he bought have their own legal exposure now that creates its own set of negotiations. Martin paused. Adrian's attorney has been in contact with the Eastern District this morning. There are discussions. I won't characterize where they'll land, but the Baltimore situation, given Duran's account and the absence of direct operational documentation, is significantly less acute than it was 48 hours ago. He's not out from under it. No, not entirely, but he's not looking at what Logan's recording suggested he was looking at. A pause. It will take time. There will be a process. But there's a path. She looked out the window. The November light was doing that thing it did in the afternoon, going gold and cold simultaneously, the specific beauty of a season in the process of dying. And Sabrina? She's been in contact with the Eastern District directly. Her cooperation, both the sworn statement she gave you and her recordings of Logan, substantially improves her position. I expect she'll be fine. Legally, I mean. Evelyn thought about the woman at the corner table of the hotel cafe, hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee, looking at the evidence of a pregnancy she'd been instrumentally responsible for complicating. Thought about what fine legally meant as a category of outcome when the other categories of a person's life had been arranged the way Sabrina Cole's had been arranged. Tell me about my assets, she said. Everything transferred cleanly. The Harrington trusts are fully separated, legally unambiguous, predating the marriage, entirely in your name and the child's. The foundation resignations are processed. Your professional name is consistent across all records. A pause. You're clean, Evelyn. Everything that's yours is yours. She sat with that for a moment. The specific weight of it, not triumph, not relief exactly, but the solid particular feeling of having done what needed to be done and having it hold. Thank you, Martin, she said, for all of it. Your father would have done the same, he said. He just would have done it faster and complained more. She laughed, a small, genuine, unexpected sound that surprised her slightly. Yes, she said. He would have. Victor called at 4. Paul Duran got home safely, he said. The confidentiality agreement is filed. His name won't surface in any organizational record. Good. There's something else. His voice had shifted, not the careful political navigation she'd heard from him all week, but something more direct. The captains that Logan had on his payroll, 3 of them have already approached Adrian, voluntarily. They're not trying to negotiate. He paused, choosing words. They're scared. They know what they did. They're coming to him before he comes to them. What will he do? A long pause. He hasn't decided yet. Another pause. He asked me what you would do. She looked at the window, at the cold afternoon light, at the city that had been the backdrop of the entire architecture of this, the penthouse, the gala, the vault, the library table covered in documents. He asked you to ask me? He asked me what I thought you would do, Victor said carefully. It's a different question. She thought about it honestly. About 3 men who had made a decision to participate in something that had hurt people, and who were now arriving at the door of the man they'd betrayed with the particular desperation of people who have run out of other options. About what it meant to extend or withhold something in a context where the landscape had fundamentally changed. I think the organization he's been running is finished, she said. Whatever comes after it, whatever legitimate structure gets built from what's left, that's not something I can advise on. But I think men who come voluntarily, before compulsion, and tell the truth about what they did, that deserves to be treated differently than men who don't. Victor was quiet for a moment. He'll want to hear that from you. Then he can ask me himself, she said, when I'm ready. She hung up and sat in the penthouse for a while longer. The light changed. She ate something, real food this time, more than toast, because her body was done being ignored. She took a shower and stood under the hot water for a long time and let the day move through her and out of her in whatever way it needed to. Then she went to the vault. She didn't remove anything. She stood in the small, specific light of her father's construction and looked at the contents, the documents, the certificates, the instruments of a financial legacy that had survived 2 market crashes, a congressional inquiry, the death of its creator, a marriage, an affair, a conspiracy, and a criminal counsel proceeding. And she felt for the first time in 12 days something that was not strategy or clarity or purposeful forward motion. She felt the specific private grief of it. Not for the marriage, she'd processed that, or begun to process it, in the 40 minutes she'd spent at the window the night she'd watched the kiss. But for the version of her life she'd believed she was living, for the woman who had managed charitable foundations and inheritance trusts and sat at gala dinner tables and believed that the careful, quiet work of sustaining something was enough. That being indispensable in the ways she'd been indispensable meant she was seen. She hadn't been seen. She'd been useful, which is a different thing, and she'd spent 6 years, maybe longer, if she was honest, maybe her whole adult life, confusing the two. She pressed her hand against the vault wall. She breathed. She let it be true, and be painful, and be hers, for as long as it needed to be those things. Then she closed the vault door and went to bed and slept 9 hours without waking. Oh, the obstetrician's appointment was at 9 the following morning. She went alone, as she'd been going alone since the week this all started. The waiting room had the particular texture of a place where significant things happened in a context designed to be as unthreatening as possible. Soft colors, a white noise machine, a fish tank that no one looked at. She sat and waited and looked at her hands and thought about nothing in particular. The ultrasound was routine, a check-in appointment, nothing diagnostic. She lay on the table in the dim room and watched the screen and listened to the sound of a heartbeat that had nothing to do with any of what had happened in the past 2 weeks. It was just a heartbeat, steady and specific and entirely itself. "Everything looks good," the technician said. "Strong." "Yes," Evelyn said. She looked at the image on the screen for a long time. The specific alien clarity of a life at 12 weeks. More formed than the last time, the shape of hands visible, the particular movement that was already distinct and individual. She watched it move and thought about Nathan. She'd been thinking Nathan for weeks, hadn't said it out loud yet, hadn't told anyone, had been keeping it as a private certainty for a moment that felt right. This felt right. "Nathan," she said quietly. Not to the technician, just to the room. She drove home in the November light and called her sister. Rebecca Harrington lived in Boston and worked in hospital administration and had been texting Evelyn every day for 2 weeks with a precision that suggested she'd been tracking the news and had made herself available without forcing her way in. Evelyn had responded to each text with enough to indicate she was functional, not enough to open the full conversation. She opened it now. Rebecca answered on the first ring. "Tell me everything," she said, with the specific directness of a woman who had grown up in the same household as Evelyn and knew that the opposite of it was a waste of both their time. Evelyn told her. Not everything. Not the council room, not the specific mechanics of what Clara had found and what Duran had said and how the federal agents had appeared in the doorway. But the shape of it. The affair and the conspiracy and the past 2 weeks and Nathan, whose name she said for the second time, and whose existence she let herself talk about without strategy or legal framing or the protective distance she'd been keeping from her own feelings about him. She cried finally, during the part about Nathan. Not from grief, from something more complicated. The specific emotion of a person who has been holding something carefully for a very long time and has finally found a context safe enough to put it down for a moment. Rebecca listened. She didn't offer explanations or solutions or the particular brand of sympathy that is really just a request to stop being upset. She said, "Come to Boston for a few days. Just come. The apartment has a guest room and I'll cook terrible food and we can watch bad television and you don't have to be strategic about anything." "I can't leave right now," Evelyn said. "There are still things to manage." "In a week, then." She thought about it. "In a week," she said. Adrian came to the penthouse on the third day after the council meeting. She told him she was ready through Victor because she wasn't ready to call him directly, and that was a true thing she didn't need to rationalize. He arrived at 7 in the evening, which was the time she'd specified, and he was on time, which told her he understood that being on time was now a form of respect rather than a simple logistical fact. She made tea. She didn't make it for him. She made it because she needed something to do with her hands while he sat at the kitchen table and looked at the apartment he'd lived in for 6 years with the particular expression of a man who is trying to figure out if he still knows the rules of a room. She sat across from him. For a while, neither of them said anything. He looked older than he had 2 weeks ago. Not dramatically, not the overnight aging of cinematic grief, but in the small, specific ways that actual hard time leaves on a face. Something in the set of his eyes. The absence of the particular authority he'd always worn the way other men wore good suits, as if it were a second skin grown over years of people responding to him with fear. She wondered if she looked different to him too. She thought she probably did. "Logan's attorney completed the cooperation agreement this morning," he said. "I spoke with the Eastern District. There's going to be a process. The Baltimore situation, the organizational records, the captain's separate exposures. It's going to take a long time." "I know. My attorney thinks—" He stopped, looked at the table. "There's a path where I come out of this without criminal exposure. It's not guaranteed. It involves a substantial amount of cooperation on my end with the federal investigation into the operational side of things." "Dismantling it," she said. "Yes." She looked at him. "That's what you should do." He looked up. Something moved in his face. Not surprise exactly, but a kind of recognition. As if he'd known that was the answer and needed to hear it from outside himself. "It's what I'm going to do," he said. "I've already started conversations with the 3 captains who came forward voluntarily. About transition. About what happens to the people inside the organization who didn't know what they were part of. They deserve to know what's coming so they can make choices," she said. "Yes. Legitimate businesses can be built from what's left. The real estate holdings, the manufacturing acquisitions you were announcing at the gala, those don't have to collapse because the criminal infrastructure around them does. That's what I'm working toward." He paused. "It's going to take years. Most things worth building do." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I need to say something, and I need you to let me say it without interrupting or redirecting." She held his gaze. "All right. What I did, the affair, the year of it, that wasn't Logan's doing. Logan exploited it. He built an operation around it, but he didn't create it. I did that." He stopped, took a breath. I've been trying to understand why, and I don't have a clean answer, and I'm not going to give you one because a clean answer is the kind of thing people construct after the fact, and it doesn't help you. What I can tell you is that I understood sometime in the middle of this week that I spent 6 years watching you do extraordinary things and taking them as evidence of how the situation worked rather than evidence of who you were." He paused. "I confused useful with ordinary. And I don't know how to make that right because I don't think it's a thing you can make right. I think it's a thing you carry." She sat with that. Let it land in the place where things landed now, not the processing chamber she'd been operating out of for 2 weeks, but somewhere below that. The place where true things went. "Yes," she said. "That's what it is." "I'm sorry." She looked at him steadily. "I know you are. I know that's not Adrian." She said it the way she'd said it in this room 2 weeks ago, and the quality of it stopped him the same way. "I know you're sorry. I believe you're sorry. That's not the problem." She set down her mug. "The problem is that I spent 6 years making myself invisible because I thought it was a form of loyalty, and I have to figure out who I am when I stop doing that. And I can't do that with you in this apartment. I can't do that while I'm also managing your situation and the organization's situation and the legal situation. I've been managing things for a month and I'm 12 weeks pregnant and I need to stop." He was quiet. "I'm going to Boston to stay with Rebecca for a while. When I come back, I want to talk to you about Nathan, about what co-parenting looks like between two people who are not going to be married, about what I need from you in that context and what you need from me." She looked at him directly. "Those are conversations I can have. I'm not able to have a conversation about reconciliation because I don't believe reconciliation is honest right now. Maybe in some different future I'll feel differently. But right now I need you to accept that we are two people who are going to raise a child together and are not going to be a couple, and I need you to do that without making it a negotiation." He looked at the table. He looked back at her. His eyes were wet, not crying, the stage before crying, the specific landscape of a man who is holding himself together through will because he understands that falling apart right now is something he doesn't get to do in front of her. "Okay," he said. "Just that." "Okay." She nodded. They sat in the kitchen for a while longer, in the way that people sit together when the important things have been said, and what remains is the simple, complicated fact of having known each other. He asked about the baby. She told him about the appointment, about Nathan's heartbeat, about the movement she'd seen on the screen. She watched him listen, really listen, with the particular quality of attention that a person gives to something they understand might be the most significant thing they will ever be adjacent to. His face did something she hadn't seen it do in a long time, something that had nothing to do with the organization or authority or the architecture of the life he'd built and was now dismantling. He looked like a father. It was the most human she'd seen him look in years. She thought about what that meant, about the person he'd been when she'd met him, and who he'd allowed himself to become inside the structure of power and fear he'd built around himself, and whether those two people were reconcilable, and whether Nathan would ever know the difference. She hoped Nathan would know the difference. She thought he might. She went to Boston the following week. Rebecca's apartment was warm and loud in the way that apartments are loud when someone lives genuinely rather than decoratively. Dishes in the drying rack, 2 cats underfoot, a radiator that clanged at night, a guest room with a window that looked out on a street where ordinary things happened at ordinary hours. Evelyn slept in that room for 5 nights, and woke up each morning to the sound of Rebecca making coffee and the cats demanding breakfast and the radiator clanging, and she thought, "This is what I forgot. This. The ordinary specific weight of a life that doesn't require management." She walked. She ate food she hadn't cooked. She let Rebecca drag her to a terrible thriller film and ate an entire bag of popcorn and didn't think about documents or council rooms or federal indictments for 2 hours. On the 3rd night, she sat in Rebecca's kitchen past midnight and talked, really talked, for the first time in years, not in the managed, careful way she'd talked to Martin or Clara or Victor or Adrian, but the way you talk to someone who knew you before you became whatever you'd spent your adult life becoming. She talked about her father, about the 6 years she'd spent building something in a structure that had never truly seen what she was building. About the night she'd watched a 6-second kiss on television and felt clarity instead of grief, and what that said about how long she'd been preparing unconsciously for the thing she'd told herself wasn't happening. Rebecca listened and drank tea, and at one point said, "You know what Dad would say." "He'd say I should have audited the marriage annually," Evelyn said. Rebecca laughed, the real, unguarded laugh of someone who had known Elias Harrington's specific financial metaphors for 40 years. "He'd say you should have established exit conditions at the outset." He'd be right. He was always right about the things that didn't matter to him personally. Rebecca looked at her sister across the kitchen table. "How are you?" "Not the situation, you." Evelyn thought about that honestly. "I'm tired," she said. "I'm sad in ways I haven't fully gotten to yet. She paused. "I'm more myself than I've been in a long time, which feels strange to say in the middle of everything falling apart." "It doesn't fall apart," Rebecca said. "You took it apart. There's a difference." She thought about that on the train back to New York. Watched Connecticut move past the window, the suburban distance between cities, the ordinary landscape of a country that had no idea what had happened in a 4th-floor council room in Lower Manhattan and wouldn't and didn't need to, and thought about the difference between something collapsing and something being deliberately dismantled. Her father had taught her how to build. He'd been less explicit about how to dismantle. But the underlying principle she understood now was the same. You had to know what you were working with, and you had to be honest about what it could bear, and you had to do the work yourself rather than waiting for someone else to tell you when it was time. She'd done that. She was still doing it. The months that followed had a quality she hadn't anticipated, the specific, unglamorous texture of actual change. Not the dramatic kind, not the clean arc of a story with a clear before and after. The real kind, which moves in increments and doubles back on itself, and involves a lot of very ordinary days in which nothing significant happens, and everything is slowly, incrementally, irrevocably different from what it was. Martin finalized the legal separation in December. Not a divorce yet. That would take longer, and she wasn't in a hurry for a process that required more energy than she currently had available, but a formal separation agreement that clarified every financial and legal dimension with the precision she'd insisted on, and that Adrian's attorney had accepted without significant negotiation, which she took as its own kind of acknowledgement. She hired 2 people to help manage the Harrington portfolio. Not because she couldn't do it alone. She could. She'd been doing it alone for years. But because she was 12, then 14, then 18 weeks pregnant, and then 6 months, and then 8. And the specific physical demands of the last trimester left her less interested in 12-hour days of financial documentation than she'd previously been. She talked to Adrian twice a week, carefully, in the specific register of 2 people who are learning a new grammar of interaction. They talked about Nathan, about the nursery she'd designed in the smaller bedroom, about the pediatrician she'd selected, about the birth plan she'd filed in the hospital and what she needed from him when the time came. He listened to all of it with the focused attention she'd watched him give Nathan's heartbeat in the kitchen, and he asked questions that told her he'd been reading, actually reading, not gesturing toward reading, about what the first year looked like. He was trying. She gave him credit for that without letting it become more than what it was. In February, Logan's arraignment produced guilty pleas on 3 counts. His attorney's cooperation agreement had been comprehensive enough that the federal case didn't require a trial. He was sentenced in April, 12 years, federal facility. The specific accounting of a man who had spent 22 months building something elaborate and hadn't adequately considered what happened when it came apart. She didn't attend the sentencing. She read the summary that Martin sent her and filed it in a folder and moved on to the next thing on her desk. Sabrina Cole received a suspended sentence and 3 years probation. The Eastern District had been persuaded, by the recording she'd provided and by her complete cooperation with every investigative request, that she had been a participant in the conspiracy without being its architect or its primary beneficiary. She left New York in March. Evelyn didn't know where she went and didn't try to find out. Victor Raines retired from the organization in January, which no one had expected, including possibly Victor. He called Evelyn to tell her himself, which she found unexpectedly moving. "I've been doing this for 30 years, he said. I think 30 was enough. What will you do?" "My daughter wants me to move to Portland. She has a grandchild I haven't met yet." A pause. "I think I'll go to Portland." "Good," she said, and meant it. Nathan Harrington was born on a Tuesday in March. 6 pounds, 11 ounces. The specific, furious, astonishing arrival of a person who had been abstract for 9 months and was suddenly, irreversibly, completely concrete. He had Adrian's hands, she noticed that immediately, with the particular clarity of a mind that noticed details even in the midst of the most significant moment of her life. And her father's forehead, and his own face, which was entirely his own, and which she looked at for a long time in the first quiet hour after everything. Adrian was there. She'd asked him to be, and he'd come, and he'd sat in the chair beside the hospital bed for the hours before, and he'd been present in the specific way she'd needed him to be present, steady, quiet, useful in the practical ways, and not in the way that required anything from her. When the nurse placed Nathan in Adrian's arms for the first time, she watched his face. She'd been watching his face for 6 years, and she'd watched it change fundamentally in the past 4 months. But this was different from all of that. This was the face of a man encountering something that required him to be larger than he'd been, in ways that had nothing to do with power or authority or the specific grammar of dominance he'd spent his adult life fluent in. He held Nathan with both hands and looked at him and didn't say anything for a long time. Then he looked at Evelyn. She expected She wasn't sure what she expected. Something she'd have to manage. Something that would require a response, a calibration, a decision about how much to give. He said, "Thank you." Not for Nathan specifically, or not only for Nathan. She understood what he meant and chose not to make him be more precise about it, because sometimes the imprecise thing is the honest thing, and precision would have required a conversation neither of them was equipped for at that particular moment. "You're going to need to learn how to swaddle," she said. "There's a video. Watch it before you come on Saturday." His mouth twitched. The beginning of something that was almost a smile, real, unmanaged, the kind of expression that only appears when a person's defenses are completely down. "I'll watch it." "Watch it twice," she said. "You're going to think you understand it after the first time." He laughed, quietly, so as not to startle Nathan. But he laughed. The first year was hard in the specific, unromantic ways that first years are hard. The sleep deprivation, which she'd intellectually prepared for, and which turned out to be a different category of experience than intellectual preparation could address. The learning curve of a human being who needed constant things and communicated his needs exclusively through volume. The specific challenge of co-parenting with someone she was not with, coordinating schedules and handoffs and decisions about pediatric care and early development with a man who was simultaneously rebuilding his entire professional and legal existence from the ground up. They were not graceful about it. They disagreed about things, small things mostly, the kinds of things that would be trivial between two people with an easy relationship, and that required actual negotiation between two people with theirs. She was more structured than he was. He was more instinctive. She had opinions about sleep schedules. He had opinions about what counted as a legitimate reason to override a sleep schedule. They figured it out, mostly, through the ordinary friction of two people who both loved the same person and wanted different things from that love to look like. Nathan, indifferent to the complexity of the situation he'd been born into, thrived. He was curious in the specific way that made everyone who interacted with him suspect he was going to be trouble eventually. Alert, active, interested in everything, utterly unconcerned with whether the interest was convenient. He had Adrian's energy and Evelyn's focus and his own personality, which was distinct from both of them in ways she found herself watching with something that felt like relief. He was his own person. He'd arrived that way. By the time he was 8 months old, the Saturday handoffs had become something she no longer braced for. They'd developed a ritual, Adrian arriving at 10, Nathan already fed and changed, a brief overlap where they talked about the week before he took Nathan for the day. It was ordinary in a way that would have seemed impossible a year ago. It was ordinary in a way that required continual, daily choice to maintain. She chose it because Nathan deserved it. She thought eventually that she chose it because she deserved it too. The specific ordinary of a life that was hers, not managed, not structured for someone else's empire, not rendered invisible by the particular architecture of a marriage that had confused useful with seen. She was building something. Under the Harrington name, with her father's financial structures as the foundation, she was building an investment practice that bore her signature in every sense, meticulous, ethically grounded, attentive to the footnotes. It was smaller than what she'd managed in the Blackwood years. It was hers. She worked from the penthouse, which she'd changed. Not dramatically, she wasn't interested in dramatic gestures, but she'd moved furniture, changed the light in the library, replaced the carpet in the main bedroom. Small alterations that shifted the quality of the space from something that bore the weight of what had happened in it to something that was simply her apartment, where she lived and worked and raised her son. The vault, she kept exactly as it was. She didn't think of it as her father's anymore. She thought of it as hers, the place where the most important documents lived, where the foundation of what she was building was preserved with the specific care that valuable things deserved. She went into it occasionally, not with the midnight urgency of crisis, but with the ordinary purpose of a person managing her own affairs. She never stopped reading the footnotes. It was Nathan's first birthday when she and Adrian had the conversation that had been waiting, unhurried, in the background of the entire year. He'd stayed after the small birthday gathering, just Rebecca, Martin, and his wife, Victor, who'd come down from Portland for the occasion, and had held Nathan with the focused care of a man who had recently learned what it was to be a grandfather and was applying that knowledge with characteristic thoroughness. After everyone left and Nathan was down for the evening, she and Adrian sat in the kitchen with coffee. Real coffee. She'd been able to drink it again for months, and the apartment was quiet around them. He said, "I've been thinking about Baltimore." She waited. "Duran's account was accurate," he said. "What I told you on the phone that night, that I was informed after the fact, that's the truth. But the truth also includes the fact that I built an organization where that kind of decision was possible at the field level, where the people working for me understood that a certain kind of outcome was acceptable. I didn't order it, but I created the conditions for it." She looked at him. "You're telling me this because you need to say it, not because you need me to respond." "Yes." "Then say it." He looked at the table. 3 people died because I built a world where their lives could be calculated against an operational objective. I didn't pull a trigger, but I built the logic that said pulling triggers could be cost-effective. He was quiet for a moment. "I'm in conversations with the Eastern District. There's a process. There are things I'm doing to try to—" He stopped. "Trying to make something that looks like accountability. I know it doesn't reach the thing itself." "No," she said. "It doesn't." "I know." She held her coffee mug. "What do you want from this conversation?" He looked up. "Nothing," he said. And the quality of it, the specific, stripped honesty of it, told her he meant it. He wasn't asking for absolution or permission or the particular female labor of making a man feel better about the things he'd done. He was just saying it to someone who would hear it and not pretend it was less than it was. "Okay," she said. They sat in the kitchen a while longer. Nathan made a small sound in the next room, a sleep sound, not distress. And they both turned toward it automatically, the involuntary attention of parents, and then relaxed and looked at each other. And something passed between them that wasn't romance and wasn't friendship exactly, but was its own thing, the specific, hard-won understanding of 2 people who had been through something together and had not come out of it unscathed and had chosen, repeatedly, to keep showing up for the person they'd made. "He's a good kid," Adrian said. "He is," she said. "He's got your way of looking at things. That thing where he focuses on something and you can see him." He paused. "Building it in his head." She smiled. "He's 8 months old." "I know, but you can already see it." She thought about her father, about Elias Harrington sitting at a kitchen table like this one and watching a small girl take apart a financial document to see how it worked, about the specific, patient way he'd watched her figure things out without telling her the answer. She thought Nathan might grow up to be like that. She thought he might grow up to be like neither of them, entirely his own, which was what she hoped for most. "Go home," she said. "He'll be up at 6. I'll call you when he's had breakfast." Adrian stood. He picked up his jacket. At the door he stopped, the way he'd been stopping, across the past year, at the door. The moment of almost something that had never resolved into a single clean thing. "Evelyn," he said. "Adrian," she said. He looked at her for a moment with that expression she still didn't have a name for, older now and different, something that had been earned by the specific currency of this year's worth of showing up and learning to be smaller than he'd been. He left. She sat at the kitchen table for a while after the elevator closed. The apartment was quiet. The city moved outside. Nathan breathed in the next room with the steady, unconcerned rhythm of a person who was entirely safe and entirely loved, and entirely unaware of the architecture that had been built and dismantled and rebuilt to ensure that those things would remain true. She thought about the kiss. 6 seconds on national television. The moment that 40 million people had seen and processed as either scandal or romance or theater, depending on their disposition. The moment she had watched from this apartment and felt clarity instead of grief, because some part of her had already been preparing for it, had already been keeping the vault combination to herself and reading the footnotes and making herself irreplaceable in ways that could survive a collapse. She thought about what Caruso had said. Your father was a good man. She thought about what the organization's captains had assumed, that she was decorative, that she needed protecting from reality, that the quiet work she did was the work of a woman who had chosen to make herself invisible and should be kept that way. She thought about what had actually been true, that she'd been the strongest person in the room every time she'd been in the room, and had simply never made them prove they knew it. She didn't regret the quiet years. She'd built things in them, real things that had outlasted the structure they'd been built inside. She did think, sitting in her kitchen in the apartment where her father had sat and where her son now slept, that she would never again be quiet in the way that required being unseen, that she would be exactly as visible as her work deserved, and that her work would deserve it, and that this was not a vow or a resolution, but simply a fact about who she was now, assembled from the specific materials of the past year. She finished her coffee. She rinsed the mug. She checked on Nathan, standing in the doorway of the small room with its careful furniture, listening to him breathe, watching the specific piece of a sleeping 8-month-old who had no idea what the world was and would have time to find out. And then she went to the library and sat at the desk and opened her laptop and worked for an hour on the investment analysis she'd been building for a new client. A woman starting a company from nothing who needed someone who understood how to build structures that lasted. She was very good at that. She worked until midnight. Then she turned off the lamp and went to bed in the apartment that was hers, in the life she was building from materials that had always been hers, in the city that moved outside the window without requiring anything of her except that she keep paying attention. She slept. And in the room next door, Nathan Harrington breathed in the dark, steady and certain and entirely himself, and grew.